Horace Braddock did not knock. He shoved the door of the Reed Valley Land Office open so hard the hinges screamed, and every man inside flinched, except the clerk, who had learned months ago that flinching only made things worse. Braddock crossed the floor in 4 long strides, planted both fists on the counter, and leaned in close enough that the clerk could smell whiskey and something meaner underneath it. "That woman," Braddock said, his voice quiet in the particular way that men used when they did not need to raise it to cause harm, "does not set one foot on my water. You tell Mercer. You tell every miserable homesteader from here to the Canyon Ridge. I don't care who she is or what paper she thinks she's carrying. Silver Creek belongs to me, and anyone who helps her find out different is going to regret it." He straightened up, adjusted his coat, and walked out. The clerk stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down because his legs would not hold him. If you've ever watched a stranger step off a train and felt the air change, felt something shift in the people standing around you, like a collective held breath, then you already understand what happened in Reed Valley on the afternoon Evelyn Hawthorne arrived. Friends, if this kind of story, full of grit, danger, and love hard-won on the frontier, is what you come here for, then this channel is your home. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a single episode. Tap the like button if you're already feeling this story pulling at you. And drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale has traveled, because stories like Evelyn's deserve to be heard from every corner of the world. Now, let's go back to Wyoming, 1878, and let's meet the storm. The telegram. Gideon Mercer sent to the Hartwell Marriage Agency in St. Louis had been precisely 6 sentences long. He had written it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening after the last of his hired hands quit, after the north fence came down in the storm, and after he stood in the doorway of the empty bunkhouse for a full 10 minutes without moving. He was not a man who wasted words or spent much time examining his own feelings, and the telegram reflected that. Widower, age 38, Wyoming Territory, working cattle ranch, need capable partner, no romance required. He'd mailed it without rereading it. The agency's response had come 3 weeks later. A letter from a woman named Clara Voss, who described herself as practical, experienced with livestock, a decent cook, and accustomed to hard work. She mentioned she was 32, that she had worked as a school teacher for 6 years, and that she preferred honesty to flattery. Gideon had read the letter twice, decided she sounded sensible, and replied with 2 sentences confirming the arrangement and the train arrival date. He did not ask what she looked like. It did not seem relevant. He drove the wagon into Reed Valley on a Thursday morning with a clean shirt and a freshly shaved jaw, which was approximately as much ceremony as he could manage. The train from Cheyenne was running 20 minutes late, so he waited on the platform with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the track, thinking about the north fence and whether the lumber delivery would arrive before the first frost. He was not thinking about Clara Voss, or about loneliness, or about anything that might have been considered personal. The train pulled in at 12 minutes past noon. Gideon watched passengers step down onto the platform. A traveling salesman with too many bags, a family with 3 young children who immediately scattered in 3 directions, an older couple moving slowly and carefully, holding on to each other's arms. He scanned the crowd for a woman who looked practical and accustomed to hard work, which he assumed would be evident somehow, and found himself scanning twice without locating anyone who matched that particular impression. Then he saw her. She came down the train steps last, which he would later think was either caution or habit, and she paused at the bottom with her hand still on the rail and looked at the platform the way a person looked at a room when they were deciding all the exits before they moved further inside. She had dark hair pinned up under a travel hat, a dress that had been well made once and was still being treated with care, and a carpet bag that she carried herself without looking around for anyone to take it from her. Her eyes were amber. He noticed that from 40 feet away, which told him something about the quality of the attention those eyes commanded. They moved across the platform with a careful, systematic thoroughness that was more soldier than schoolteacher, and when they found him, standing a head taller than most men in the crowd, hat in hand, staring openly, they stopped and held without blinking. Gideon walked toward her. She did not move toward him. She waited, which he would also think about later. "Miss Voss," he said when he reached her. Something crossed her face, a flicker of something complicated, not guilt exactly, but close kin to it. "My name is Evelyn Hawthorne," she said. "I can explain." Gideon stood very still. "That wasn't Clara Voss's name." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He looked at her for a moment. She met his gaze straight on and did not offer anything else, which struck him as either very confident or very desperate, and he could not yet tell which. "All right," he said, "get in the wagon." She looked at him. "That's all you're going to say?" "I figure I'll get more useful information if I wait until you're ready to give it than if I stand here demanding it on a train platform where half the town is watching us." Her eyes moved briefly to the left and right. She'd already clocked the watchers, he realized, and something in her expression shifted just slightly. Not relaxed, something more like reassessment. "That's a reasonable," she said. "I have them occasionally." She followed him to the wagon without further conversation. He noticed she checked behind her twice on the way across the platform. The road out of Reed Valley followed the creek north for 3 miles before it climbed toward the benchland where Gideon's ranch sat. The drive took the better part of an hour in good weather, and the weather that afternoon was fine. Clear sky, mild wind, the kind of October afternoon that Wyoming offered only occasionally and never promised twice. They rode in silence for the first quarter mile. Gideon let it sit there. He'd learned that silence made some people uncomfortable enough to fill it with honesty they hadn't planned to offer, and he was curious what kind of honesty Evelyn Hawthorne would reach for when the quiet got heavy enough. "You're not going to ask me anything," she said. "I'm going to ask you everything," he said. "I'm just waiting until you're not braced for it." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "You think you can tell when someone is braced?" "I can tell when you are," he said. "You've been ready to argue since you stepped off that train. I don't particularly want an argument. I want the truth, and those two things don't always arrive at the same time." The silence came back. This time it had a different quality. "Clara Voss was a real person," Evelyn said finally. "She genuinely intended to come. She fell ill 2 weeks before the departure date. Seriously ill, not a convenient kind of ill, and she asked me to write to the agency and explain. I went to the agency in her place. They told me the arrangement would have to be dissolved. But it wasn't dissolved. I asked them to let me take her place." Gideon said nothing. "I know how that sounds," Evelyn said. "Tell me why you needed to leave St. Louis badly enough to do it." She was quiet again. The wagon rolled through a stretch of cottonwoods, and the light came through in pieces. "My father arranged a marriage for me," she said, "to a man named Vincent Caldwell. Vincent has a great deal of money and very few scruples, and my father has the opposite problem. Very few scruples and not as much money as he once did. The arrangement suited both of them considerably. It didn't suit you." "Vincent Caldwell has already been married twice," she said. "The first wife died young. The second wife left when she could and never spoke publicly about why, which I found considerably more informative than anything anyone told me directly." Gideon kept his hands loose on the reins. "And your father didn't care about any of that." "My father cared that Vincent was willing to pay off his debts in exchange for the arrangement. There's also a land inheritance from my mother, property in 3 different territories, held in trust until I married. My father cannot touch it. Vincent, as my husband, could." She paused. "So no, my father did not particularly care. Who's the judge?" She turned to look at him again, sharper this time. "How did you— You said your father arranged it. You haven't mentioned your father being a man with legal authority to enforce anything, but you left the way someone leaves when they know the law has already been arranged against them." The silence that followed was longer. "Judge Harlan Pruitt," she said quietly, "a family associate. My father asked him to formalize the arrangement in a way that would make it very difficult for me to refuse legally. There were papers filed. I don't know all the details. They didn't explain the details to me. They just told me to sign and prepare to travel to New York. Instead, you came here." "Instead, I came here." Gideon thought about that. The wagon crested a low rise and the bench land opened ahead of them, and his ranch buildings came into view. The main house, the damaged barn with its partially collapsed roof, the empty corral, the creek glinting down below the north pasture. "That's what you're working with," he said. He wasn't apologizing for it. She looked at the property with the same careful thoroughness she'd used on the train platform. "The barn roof needs replacing. The corral fence looks like one section gave way. The northwest post, from the angle." You can read a fence line from half a mile. My mother's family kept horses. She looked at the house. The house looks solid. It is. My wife and I built it 8 years ago. He said it plainly, without the careful brace around it that men sometimes used when they mentioned dead wives. She died 4 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry. Thank you. He meant it simply. I need help with the ranch. I need someone capable and honest. I don't need anything more than that, and I'm not expecting it. Whatever you told the agency, you're here now, and I'm not going to send you back. She looked at him. Even knowing why I came? Especially knowing why you came, he said. A woman who needed a safe place badly enough to do what you did is either very brave or very desperate, and in my experience, those two things are usually the same thing. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. There's a room off the kitchen. It has a good lock on the door, and I put the key on the inside, which is where it'll stay. Evelyn Hawthorne sat very still on the wagon seat for a moment. I didn't expect that, she said. Most people don't expect someone to just take them at their word, he said. He climbed down and offered his hand to help her down. Not as a formality, but as a practical matter, since the wagon step was higher than it looked. I find it works better than the alternative. She took his hand and stepped down. Her grip was firm. She looked at the house again, then at the barn, then at the line of hills along the north horizon. Someone followed me from St. Louis, she said. I don't know how close. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then we'd better get inside and figure out what we're dealing with, he said. Margaret Tilson was the first person in Reed Valley to see Evelyn Hawthorne outside of the train platform crowd, and Margaret was the kind of woman who believed that first impressions were essentially verdicts. She had come to Gideon's fence line that afternoon on the thin pretext of returning a borrowed grain measure, which she could have sent with her husband at any point in the past 2 weeks, but had not, because she had wanted to see the mail-order bride herself. What she saw through the fence, a woman in a traveling dress standing next to Gideon Mercer's wagon, looking at his property the way a buyer looks at a horse, not with sentiment, but with attention. She watched how Evelyn moved, how she carried herself, how she looked at Gideon when he spoke, and how she looked away from him when she was thinking. Margaret went home and told her husband that Gideon Mercer had not gotten what he ordered. Is she trouble? Her husband asked. Margaret thought about it. I don't know yet, she said, but she's not timid, and I'm not sure Gideon knows what he's gotten himself into. Her husband, who had been married to Margaret for 27 years and had learned that her instincts about people were generally better than his, went back to his supper without further comment. The first thing Evelyn did when she was alone in the room off the kitchen was check the window latch and the door lock and put her carpet bag where she could reach it in the dark if she needed to. The second thing she did was sit on the edge of the bed and let herself shake for 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she permitted herself. She had been running for 19 days. She had slept in 4 different train cars, eaten twice at railway station counters where she wasn't sure the food was safe, and spent most of the journey watching windows and doors with the kind of sustained vigilance that used up something fundamental in a person. She was tired in a way that sleep would not immediately fix. But she was here. And the man who had met her at the station had not been what she'd prepared for. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for legal threats, or for a man who felt cheated and had opinions about what to do with a woman who had deceived him. She had prepared for cruelty, which was a kind of preparation she'd had too much practice with. She had not prepared for, I'm not going to send you back. She had not prepared for the way he'd said it, flat, settled, as if the matter was already decided and he'd moved on to the practical next questions. She sat in the small room with its solid walls and its keyed lock and thought, don't trust it yet. Don't trust it. But the shaking stopped in less than 30 seconds, which was not usually how that went. Gideon made supper. Salt pork and beans with cornbread, which was what he made when he hadn't planned for a guest, which was always, and knocked on the door of the room off the kitchen to let her know. She came out looking like she'd splashed water on her face and reordered herself, which he respected. Some people came out of hard journeys crumpled and others came out deliberate, and he'd always found the deliberate ones more interesting to work with, even if they were harder to read. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and ate without ceremony, which he appreciated. He'd known women who picked at food to make a point and women who ate like they meant it, and he knew which kind was going to be useful. Tell me about the man who followed you, he said. She finished chewing first. His name is Silas Kincaid. He works as a tracker. He was hired by Vincent. I think by Vincent, though it's possible my father arranged it separately. He's good at what he does. I lost him in Kansas City when I switched lines without purchasing a ticket for the second train in advance, but that buys time, not safety. How long before he picks up the trail here? Days, maybe. A week if I was careful enough. Less if Vincent has other people looking. She set her fork down. I should tell you that there are papers. Letters my mother wrote before she died. She suspected my father's intentions regarding her estate, and she documented things. I have some of them with me. Others were with a housekeeper who left my father's employ before he could dismiss her. If Vincent's people find those letters before I can... She stopped. Gideon waited. My mother owned property, she said, including a land claim in Wyoming territory. I didn't know the specific location when I wrote to the agency. I found out 2 days before I left. She met his eyes. The claim includes a water source called Silver Creek. Gideon set his own fork down. Silver Creek Spring, he said. His voice was careful. Yes. Horace Braddock has spent the last 3 years trying to buy that spring. When buying didn't work, he started using other methods. I know, she said. That's partly why I was afraid to tell you. You thought I might be working with him. I didn't know what I was walking into. He looked at her for a long moment. I've had 2 fences cut, a water trough poisoned, and a legal document filed claiming my access to the spring is invalid. That last one was filed 6 months ago by a lawyer I've never met, on behalf of a landowner whose name I've never heard. You're telling me that name was your father. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something raw there. I think so, she said. I think my father has been selling claims he doesn't have clear title to. He's been doing it for years. And when my mother's property transfers to me properly, which requires me to be legally free of Vincent's claim, those fraudulent sales fall apart. Gideon was quiet for a moment. So Vincent Caldwell needs you to be his wife because as my husband, he controls my inheritance, including the spring, and he can allow Braddock's purchase to stand without any of the documentation coming to light. She looked at her hands. If I marry Vincent, everyone who has been defrauded stays defrauded. If I remain free, the whole structure collapses. Gideon pushed back from the table and stood. He went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and the darker barn and thought about the shape of what she'd just told him. You came to the right place, he said finally, for the wrong reasons. But you're here, and the situation is what it is. You should send me away, she said. I'm telling you that honestly. What's coming for me is going to land on you. He turned around. I had 4 good hands working this ranch 2 years ago, he said. Braddock pushed them out, threatened their families, flooded their credit with false debt claims. The man is already trying to break me. You being here doesn't change the direction of the wind, Evelyn. It just tells me I now know what he's actually after. She stared at him. You're angry, she said. Not a question. Yes. At Braddock. At your father. At the kind of men who treat property and people as the same category. He sat back down. Not at you. The kitchen's very quiet. Thank you, she said finally. Don't thank me yet, he said. We haven't gotten through this. Later, Gideon walked the perimeter of the ranch the way he did every night, checking gates, checking the corral, listening to the dark. It was a habit from early years, from the time before the ranch had hands, and it was just him and Eleanor managing everything themselves. He missed Eleanor in the practical way a man misses a person who knew exactly which floorboard creaked and exactly how to read the weather coming off the northwest peaks. He had stopped missing her in the grieving way, mostly. He had not stopped being grateful that she'd been real. He stood at the north fence and looked toward the hills, and thought about Evelyn Hawthorne's amber eyes moving across his property with professional attention, and the way she'd told him a complicated, dangerous truth over salt pork and beans without flinching from any of it. He was nearly back to the house when he saw the light. It was moving, a lantern or a torch, down in the meadow below the barn, moving in a way that didn't suggest a person who was lost or trying to be seen. It was moving like a person who had a purpose and was keeping themselves low. Gideon did not run. He walked back to the house fast and knocked twice on the room door. There's someone on the property, he said through the door. Get your bag and come to the main room. A beat. Then, give me 20 seconds. She came out in 17, dressed, with her carpet bag and something he hadn't expected. A small Remington revolver held in a practiced grip, barrel pointed correctly down. He noted the grip. "You've used that." "My mother's cousin taught me," she said. "Are they near the barn?" "Moving toward it." "The letters," she said. "The ones I'm carrying, if someone knows I have them." "Inside first," he said. "Bar the doors." They moved together to the main room, and Gideon pulled the Spencer repeating rifle from its place above the door and checked the load, which was already full because he was that kind of man. He put Evelyn at the front window and himself at the side door, and they waited. The smell came first. Smoke. Thin and sharp, then heavier. The particular thick smell of straw catching, of wood that had been waiting for exactly this. "The barn," Evelyn said. Gideon was already moving. He had the door open and was across the yard before he'd fully made the decision to run, because there were 3 horses in that barn, and they were his, and no threat assessment in the world was going to let him stand still with horses burning. "Mercer," Evelyn's voice from the doorway. Sharp, controlled. "There are 2 of them." He saw them then. One man already retreating toward the tree line at a run, another one standing ground near the barn door with something in his hand, a club or a handle, watching Gideon come and calculating something. Gideon did not slow down. The man with the club swung. Gideon ducked inside the swing the way men do when they have taken a hit once from that exact angle and learned the geometry from the pain, and came back up with his elbow into the man's jaw. The man went down hard and sideways and did not get up immediately. Gideon got the barn doors open and the smoke was bad, but the fire was still mostly in the loft corner, straw and old boards, not yet the main structure. He got the horses out, all 3 of them, spooked and pulling, but out, and kicked a water barrel sideways to flood the base of the fire before it could find the main beams. When he turned around, Evelyn was standing 10 feet away with her Remington up, pointed at the man on the ground, who had regained enough sense to look scared. "He's not Kincaid," she said. "I don't know him." "Braddock's," Gideon said. He was breathing hard. "I've seen him in town." The man on the ground looked between them. He had the expression of someone who had been hired for a much simpler job and was now deeply regretting his professional choices. "You're going to tell me who sent you," Gideon said. He crouched down to the man's level. "And then I'm going to tie you up and ride you into town at first light and hand you to the sheriff. That's the whole deal. There's no other option on the table." The man looked at the Remington. He looked at Gideon's face. "Braddock," he said. "Just Braddock. I don't know nothing about any Eastern man. He said to burn what I could and scare the woman off." "How did Braddock know about the woman?" Evelyn said. Her voice was very steady. The man blinked. "He's known for a week. Said a man from back east sent word she was coming." Evelyn lowered the revolver slowly. She and Gideon looked at each other across the yard with the barn smoke drifting between them and 3 frightened horses pulling at their leads. "Kincaid sent word ahead," she said. "Before he even lost you in Kansas City," Gideon said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The fire was out. The horses were upset but unhurt. The barn had lost the loft corner, but the structure was standing. Gideon stood up and dusted his knee. "Get some rope," he said. "There's some on the peg inside the door." Evelyn went and got the rope. She came back and handed it to him, and then stood beside him while he tied the man's hands, and she did not look like someone who had just survived the first night of something that was going to get considerably worse before it got better. She looked like someone who had already known it was going to get worse and had made her peace with that some time ago. Gideon tied the knot, firm, clean, no drama, and stood. "Inside," he said. "We've got a lot to figure out before morning." She nodded. And when she turned and walked back toward the house, he noticed that she checked the tree line once, twice, and then let herself go through the door. He stood in the yard alone for one moment, looking at the dark hills north of the ranch, thinking about Horace Braddock in his big house on the other side of the ridge, and the kind of man who would burn a barn on a woman's first night and call that business. Then he went inside and closed the door, and thought about what morning was going to bring. The man Gideon had tied up gave his name as Roy Purcell, which was probably true since it was the kind of name a person didn't invent under pressure. He sat against the porch post with his hands behind him and said very little else until Gideon crouched in front of him a second time, just before 3 in the morning, and asked him a specific question. "Braddock tell you what to do if she didn't scare?" Roy Purcell looked at the ground. He said she'd scare. He was wrong. What were the secondary instructions? A long pause. The other man, the one who ran, he had different instructions. I don't know what they were. Braddock doesn't tell the left hand what the right hand is doing. Gideon stood up. He looked at Evelyn, who was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed and her Remington tucked back in her bag, listening. The other man had different instructions, she said quietly, more to herself than to Gideon. Meaning, while Roy here was burning your attention toward the barn, Gideon said, someone else was supposed to be doing something else. They both turned and looked at the house at the same time. Evelyn moved first. She went through the front door fast, through the main room, through the kitchen, and into the small room off the back. Gideon heard her stop. He came in behind her and saw what she was looking at. The window latch was broken from the outside. The window was open 2 inches. Her carpetbag was on the bed where she'd left it. She crossed to it and opened it with hands that were not quite steady and went through it with the particular speed of a person who knows exactly where everything should be. The letters, she said. Her voice had gone flat in a way that was worse than if she'd been loud. The ones I was carrying, the most recent ones, my mother's last documented statement about the property holdings. She turned the bag over. They're gone. Gideon stood in the doorway. The fire was a distraction, he said. Yes. They didn't need to scare you off. They needed to get into this room while we were in the yard. She set the bag down on the bed. She stood very still with her hands at her sides. Gideon watched her work through it, not panicking, not collapsing, just processing the dimensions of what had just happened and what it meant. Those letters documented my mother's original land filing, she said. Without them, I have my testimony and nothing else. Vincent's lawyers will argue the filing was fraudulent from the start. They've probably already prepared that argument. They just needed those letters removed so I couldn't counter it. Are there other copies? She looked at him. Margaret Doyle. She was my mother's housekeeper for 11 years. When my mother realized what my father was planning, she gave Margaret a set of copies to hold. Margaret left my father's employ before he could prevent it. I don't know where she is now. She mentioned family in the territories, but I never had a specific address. We'll find her, Gideon said. Gideon. She said his name for the first time, and it came out quietly and without performance. They moved fast. This wasn't improvised tonight. Someone had already been on this property, already knew the layout of the house. This was planned before I arrived. He felt the full weight of that settle. Kincaid, he said, or someone Kincaid sent. He may not even be in Wyoming yet. He may have had a man here already, waiting, in case I came this direction. She sat down on the edge of the bed. I underestimated how organized they are. I thought I had more time. You had 19 days. 19 days, he said. You got here. That counts. It doesn't count for much without those letters. Gideon leaned against the doorframe and thought. The fire was out. Roy Purcell was tied to the porch. The horses were loose in the yard and would need to be corralled before morning. The loft corner of the barn was destroyed and would need to be rebuilt before the first serious snow, which in Wyoming could arrive at any point between now and 3 weeks from now without much warning. And somewhere between his fence line and the far ridge, a man with different instructions had ridden away into the dark with letters that could decide the future of this ranch, this valley, and the woman sitting on the edge of his guest bed looking at her empty hands. Get some sleep, he said. I mean it. 2 hours if nothing else. I'll sit with Purcell and watch the yard. You need sleep too. I'll get it when I'm dead, he said, and it came out more tired than dark. 2 hours, Evelyn. We can't think clearly like this, and we're going to need to think very clearly in the morning. She looked at him for a moment with those amber eyes that didn't give away everything, just most things. All right, she said. He went back to the porch. Morning came the way. Wyoming mornings came in October, fast and cold, the light arriving before any warmth followed it. Gideon had not slept. He had sat on the porch steps with his rifle across his knees and his coffee going cold in the tin cup and thought through the shape of the problem from every angle he could find. The shape of the problem was this. Horace Braddock was not acting alone. He had known about Evelyn before she arrived. He had coordinated with someone in the East, Vincent Caldwell, or the men Vincent employed, to time the document theft with her arrival. That kind of coordination took weeks of planning and a communication network that ran across several states. This was not a land dispute. It was a machinery. And Gideon was one man with a damaged barn, a Spencer rifle, and a woman the machinery had been specifically designed to crush. He drove Roy Purcell into Reed Valley at first light, tied in the wagon bed. Roy had not said another useful word all night, which Gideon respected in a bleak sort of way. The man was many things, but he wasn't a complete fool. Evelyn rode beside Gideon on the wagon seat, and she had done something with her face during those 2 hours that he couldn't quite name, put something away, or taken something out, and the result was that she looked composed in a way that had nothing soft in it. Sheriff Dale Purdy was a man of 50 who had come to Reed Valley 8 years ago and stayed because the winters reminded him of somewhere he could no longer clearly remember. He was not corrupt. He was also not brave in the way that required action against powerful men, which was a distinction that mattered enormously in the present situation. He listened to Gideon's account with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes moving between Gideon and Evelyn and the tied man in the chair at the side of the room. "Roy Purcell," the sheriff said. "I know his face. He's ridden for Braddock." "He admitted it last night," Gideon said. "He admitted it last night," the sheriff repeated, with the particular tone of a man turning a problem over. "In front of witnesses. In front of me and Miss Hawthorne." The sheriff looked at Evelyn. "You're the mail order, sir?" "I'm the woman whose room was broken into last night while her barn burned," Evelyn said, "and I'd like to know what you're going to do about it." Purdy shifted in his chair. "I'll hold Purcell, talk to him properly. As for Braddock," Gideon said, "I want it on the record that I have reported this to you directly and named him by name." "It's noted." "I want more than noted." "Gideon," Purdy's voice carried something careful in it, "you know what Braddock is in this valley. I can question him. I can't arrest a man on the testimony of a woman who—" He stopped. "On the testimony of a woman who what?" Evelyn said. The sentence finished itself in the silence. Purdy had the good grace to look uncomfortable. "It's not personal, Miss Hawthorne." "It is extremely personal," she said. "It's my property and my safety, which makes it the definition of personal." She stood up. "But I take your meaning. You're telling me that in this valley, Horace Braddock's word outweighs mine. I'll remember that." She walked to the door and waited for Gideon. He held Purdy's gaze for a moment. "You know what's right," Gideon said. "Knowing and doing are different things with men like Braddock," Purdy said quietly. "They usually are," Gideon said, "until someone makes them the same." He followed Evelyn out. On the main street of Reed Valley, the morning was in full operation. Wagons, foot traffic, the general industry of a small frontier town going about its Thursday. And the people on that street watched Gideon Mercer come out of the sheriff's office with the new woman, and the watching had a quality to it that Evelyn recognized from experience and Gideon recognized from the last 2 years of being Braddock's primary target. It was the watching of people who already knew something was happening and were waiting to see which side would be safer to stand on. Thomas Greer was the first to approach. He ran the feed store and had sold to Gideon for 6 years, and had the careful expression of a man who had something to say and wasn't sure it would be welcome. "Gideon," he said, "heard there was trouble at your place last night." "Barn fire. Contained." Greer nodded slowly. He looked at Evelyn and then back at Gideon. "Braddock came by my store this morning, before 7. Gideon went still. "Said you'd brought trouble into the valley. Said the woman you married—" He stopped. His words, not mine. Said she had legal problems back east. Said there were questions about her sanity. Evelyn's expression did not change. She had heard worse about herself from closer quarters. But Gideon felt something go tight in his chest. "Braddock said that in your store," he said. "In my store and on the street and in the feed yard," Greer said. He was not comfortable delivering this. "He was making a circuit of it. I figured you should know." "Thank you, Thomas." Greer hesitated. "She in real trouble?" Gideon looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "She's standing right here," Evelyn said to Greer, quietly, without heat. "You can ask me." Greer looked at her directly for the first time. Something in her directness seemed to catch him off guard. "Are you?" he asked. "In real trouble?" "Yes," she said. "But the trouble is being manufactured by people who want something I legally own, which is a different kind of trouble than the kind Braddock wants this town to think I'm in." Greer absorbed that. "What do they want?" "Silver Creek Spring." The silence that followed that sentence was comprehensive. Greer looked at her. He looked at Gideon. Your mother's claim, he said slowly, as if he were working something out. You know about it? Evelyn said. I heard rumors years ago that the Spring had competing claims. Never knew who the other party was. He pulled at his jaw. If you're the other party, then Braddock's been operating on stolen ground for 3 years, Gideon said. Greer was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I need to think about this. That's fair, Gideon said. They left him on the sidewalk, thinking. Braddock's office was the largest building on Reed Valley's main street that wasn't a saloon, and he was sitting in the front window of it when Gideon's wagon rolled past, and Evelyn did not look away from him as they passed, which was a small thing that took something considerable. Braddock was a big man, not fat, but substantial, the kind of build that suggested he had once done physical work and now employed other people to do it instead while retaining the architecture of someone who could still cause harm if he chose. He was perhaps 55, with gray at his temples, and the careful dress of a man who understood that appearance communicated authority. He watched Evelyn pass and smiled, which was worse than if he'd glared. He's not afraid, she said. He hasn't had reason to be, Gideon said. Not yet. He will be. She said it without drama, looking straight ahead at the road out of town, and Gideon believed her in the way he believed weather predictions from men who had been watching the same sky for 30 years. Not because they were always right, but because they understood what they were looking at. The day passed in the hard, practical work of damage assessment and repair. The barn loft corner was a write-off. The burned timber had to come down before the structure could be rebuilt, and Gideon spent the better part of the morning pulling it apart with a pry bar while Evelyn worked the corral fence, replacing the northwest post that had given way. She worked without being asked, without commentary, and she worked correctly, which was something Gideon noticed and filed without remark. In the early afternoon, she came into the barn where he was assessing the main beams. The northwest pasture fence has 3 other weak posts, she said, the kind that look solid until you push them. I marked them. With what? Strips of red cloth from a shirt that was past wearing. She looked at the beam he was examining. Is the main structure sound? The fire didn't reach the load-bearing points. Loft is gone, but the barn stands. She put her hand against the beam, not testing it, just feeling it, and something crossed her face that he couldn't name, some private accounting. My mother's family had a barn like this, she said. Different territory. Same kind of building, put up by people who intended to stay. She pulled her hand back. I never expected to care about a place that wasn't mine yet. It's not yours yet, he said, but you can still care about it. She looked at him sideways. That's a generous reading of the situation. It's the accurate one. He set down the pry bar. We need to talk about the next move. Braddock is already working the town. By tomorrow, half the valley will have heard that you're mentally unstable, and I've been deceived by a woman with legal problems. And the other half? The other half will wait to see which version wins. He picked up his hat from the nail and put it on. We need to find Margaret Doyle before Braddock's people do. If she has copies of those letters, she has them. Evelyn's voice was certain. My mother trusted her absolutely. Then we need to send inquiries today. Do you have any information? A town, a territory, a family, name? Her sister married a man named Cole. They were somewhere in Colorado or New Mexico. Margaret mentioned Denver once, in passing. She frowned. It isn't much. It's a start. I know a man in Denver who does correspondence work, former lawyer who quit the practice for reasons I didn't ask about. He can make discreet inquiries faster than I can from here. Gideon moved toward the barn door. I need you to write down everything you remember about Margaret. Names, descriptions, any details she gave you. I'll get a telegram out this afternoon. Evelyn caught his arm as he passed her, not grabbing, just a hand on his sleeve, stopping him. Gideon. He waited. Why are you doing this? She said. I mean the true answer, not the practical one. He thought about it honestly, which was how he'd been raised to think about questions. Because the men arranging this are the kind of men who believe that having money and connections is the same thing as being right, he said. I have personal feelings about that belief. Your wife, she said quietly. Was that? No. Eleanor died of fever. That was just the cruelty of nature, which doesn't have motives. He looked at the barn door, the morning light coming through. But the men who tried to buy this ranch from me the year after she died when I was grieving and not thinking clearly. And who told me the spring access was conditional on sale? Those men work for Braddock. And I signed nothing, and they have not forgiven me for it. He looked back at her. So when I tell you that Braddock is already my problem, I mean it was my problem long before you stepped off that train. She released his sleeve. All right, she said. All right, he said, and went to hitch the wagon. The telegram went out at 4 in the afternoon. By 5, the response to a preliminary inquiry confirmed that a man matching Silas Kincaid's description had been seen in Cheyenne 2 days prior, which put him perhaps a day's ride from Reed Valley. Gideon read the telegram response in the telegraph office with a particular stillness. He sent one more telegram to a lawyer in Laramie named Edward Sutton, who had handled his land paperwork when he bought the ranch, and who was the kind of lawyer who read documents carefully enough to find what was missing as well as what was there. He asked Sutton to begin pulling the public land records for Silver Creek Spring and any filings associated with property held by a woman named Caroline Hawthorne or her estate. He drove back to the ranch in the early dark and told Evelyn what he'd done. She was at the kitchen table when he came in, writing by lamplight, the account of Margaret Doyle, as requested, in a hand that was small and precise and densely informative. Kincaid is in Cheyenne, he said. She kept writing for one more sentence. Then she set the pen down. How long? A day, maybe 2. He's careful, so probably 2. He won't come directly, she said. He'll observe first. Map the layout, identify access points, understand what he's dealing with. That's useful information. It means we have time, but not the kind of time that feels comfortable. She picked up the pages she'd written. Margaret Doyle, everything I know. She handed it to him. Her sister's married name is Anna Cole. Margaret mentioned that her brother-in-law worked in mining equipment. She said the Denver yards, which I took to mean a warehouse district. She has a specific laugh, loud and sudden, like she forgot to contain it. She's about 60 now, small, white hair she keeps in 2 braids. She carries a small blue notebook she's had for years. She called my mother Miss Caroline even after the marriage. Gideon read the pages. This is good, thorough. She was important to my mother. She's the only person who documented what my father was doing in real time, as it happened, because she was in the house and she understood what she was seeing. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. If we find her, we have everything. If Kincaid finds her first, he won't, Gideon said. He said it like it was a fact he intended to make true by force of will, which was the only kind of fact available to them at the moment. Evelyn looked at him. She had the expression of a person who had learned not to rely on other people's certainty and was now in the strange position of wanting to, just slightly, just this once. You can't promise that, she said. No, but I can work toward it hard enough that the promise becomes mostly true. He set the papers down. I'm going to ride the perimeter tonight. Full circuit, full dark. If Kincaid sends anyone ahead, I want to know the ground they'd use. I'm coming with you. He looked up. I can ride, she said. I've been riding since I was 7, and I know what Kincaid's people look like. I've seen 2 of them at close range. You haven't. He thought about arguing. He thought about what arguments were available to him and how persuasive they were. There are 2 horses in the corral, he said. They rode the perimeter in the dark, north first along the creek, then east toward the tree line, then south along the ridge road. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were extravagant in the way Wyoming stars were at altitude, which was a beauty that didn't care about the people moving beneath it. Evelyn rode well. He'd said she could, and she'd said she could, and both of those things turned out to be accurate, which meant they moved at a pace that covered ground instead of managing the pace of a reluctant rider. She saw the thing he missed. They were moving along the South Ridge Road when she reined her horse to a stop so abruptly that Gideon pulled up 3 strides later and turned. What? Tree line, 40 yards. There's a shape that didn't move with the wind. He looked. The cottonwoods along the south fence were moving in the light breeze, branches shifting, and in among them, slightly left of center, something that held still when everything around it moved. Good eye, he said quietly. Don't move yet, she said, equally quiet. If it's a person, they'll shift in the next minute. They always do. Holding completely still is harder than people think. They sat their horses without moving. 40 seconds later, the shape moved, just slightly, a weight shift, a head turning. Enough. He's alone, she said. How do you know? The way he's positioned. A pair watches differently. One active, one passive. He's doing both himself. She kept her eyes on the shape. That's Kincaid's method. He sends one person ahead to map. The main man comes after. So this isn't Kincaid. This is someone Kincaid will hear from tomorrow. She paused. If we take him, Kincaid loses his information. And he comes in blind. And he comes in blind, she agreed. Gideon thought about the geometry. The man was 40 yards into the tree line. He had a horse somewhere nearby, almost certainly, which meant a mounted pursuit if he ran, which he would the moment he knew he'd been spotted. Can you cut around the south end of the fence and come up behind the tree line before he can reach his horse? Gideon asked. Yes. Give me 3 minutes. She turned her horse quietly and walked it back down the ridge road and out of the man's sight line, and then she was gone into the dark. Gideon sat still on his horse and watched the shape in the tree line and waited. The 3 minutes were the longest 3 minutes of a day that had contained several long intervals, and at the end of them he heard a sharp whistle from the south end of the fence, 2 notes, descending, which was what they'd agreed on. He urged his horse forward at a trot, not rushing, covering the distance steadily, and by the time he reached the tree line, Evelyn had the man's horse by the bridle, and the man himself was standing with his hands visible, and an expression that was trying to arrange itself into indignation, but kept slipping toward scared. He was young, 23, 24. Not Kincaid's usual age for this kind of work, which meant either Kincaid was using cheaper help, or this man had some other qualification. You have anything that tells me who you work for? Gideon said. The young man said nothing. Gideon looked at Evelyn. She looked back. He was hired by telegram, she said, paid half in advance. Looks like a man who needed the money badly enough not to ask careful questions. She looked at the young man. Am I wrong? Something in his face confirmed it without him saying a word. What's your name? She asked him. A pause. Then, Jem Castor. Jem, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen to it seriously. The man who hired you is going to be arrested within the week. Whatever he promised you for information on this ranch is not going to be paid. And if you're found to be working in association with him when that happens, you will be answering to a judge. Jem Castor looked at her. He looked at Gideon. He looked at his horse, which Evelyn was still holding. I just needed to watch the place, he said. I wasn't going to hurt nobody. I know, she said, not unkindly. Go home, Jem. Wherever home is. Gideon looked at her. She met his eyes briefly. A look that said, I know, but putting a 23-year-old in jail for watching a fence doesn't help us, and it doesn't hurt them. She released the horse. Jem Castor mounted in a hurry and rode south without looking back. They listened to the hoofbeats fade. He'll report to Kincaid, Gideon said. Yes, but he'll report that we spotted him and let him go, which tells Kincaid we're not frightened, which is information I want Kincaid to have. Gideon looked at her in the dark. You think tactically, he said. I've had to, she said. She turned her horse back toward the ranch road. When you've been outgunned for long enough, you start thinking about what information costs and what it's worth. They rode back in companionable quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from having just done something together that required trust, and finding that the trust held. They were a quarter-mile from the house when Gideon said, without particular preamble, My wife would have liked you. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What was she like? Stubborn. Funny in a dry way that people didn't always catch. She could look at a problem from 6 angles before most people found the first one. He paused. She had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. It was occasionally exhausting. That sounds like a compliment. It was meant as one. Another quiet. My mother was like that, Evelyn said. Precise. She noticed things other people skipped over. It's why she documented everything. She understood that the record mattered, that memory alone wasn't enough. Her voice shifted slightly. I think she knew, at the end, that I was going to need those records, that she wouldn't be there to speak for herself. Gideon didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response as much as they needed a witness. The ranch came into view. The dark house, the damaged barn, the creek-catching light somewhere below. Tomorrow's going to be hard, he said. Most of them have been, she said. I'm used to it. They put the horses up and went inside, and Gideon checked every latch and every window before he sat down at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, thinking about lawyers and telegrams, and the day after tomorrow when Silas Kincaid would ride into Reed Valley and the shape of the problem would change again into something harder and more specific. He was still sitting there when the lamp burned down. He didn't go to bed. He refilled it and kept thinking. Some nights that was the most productive thing a person could do. The legal documents arrived on a Friday morning, which Gideon later thought was deliberate. Friday gave the rumors the entire weekend to spread before anyone with authority could formally respond. The sheriff's deputy brought them to the ranch just after 8, with the expression of a man who did not enjoy his job that morning and had the decency to show it. He handed the envelope to Gideon on the porch and said, "I'm just delivering, Gideon. That's all this is." And Gideon nodded and let him go without making it harder than it needed to be. He brought the envelope inside and opened it at the kitchen table. Evelyn was already up, already dressed, already at the stove with the coffee going, and she turned when she heard the paper and read his face before she read the documents. "Show me," she said. He laid them on the table. She stood beside him and read without touching them, which he noticed, as if she didn't want her fingerprints on whatever was written there, as if contact with it would make it more real. It took her about 90 seconds to read through 3 pages of legal language, which told him she had some familiarity with legal language and was not reading it for the first time in her life. "Judge Harlan Pruitt," she said when she finished. Her voice was very flat. "He filed in Laramie County 3 days ago, before I had time to establish anything here." "He filed it before you arrived," Gideon said. "Look at the date on the second page." She looked. The filing was dated 11 days prior to her arrival in Reed Valley. 11 days before she stepped off that train, a judge in St. Louis had already prepared a legal document asserting that Evelyn Hawthorne had been determined mentally incompetent by a court of record, that her recent actions, including unauthorized travel and fraudulent misrepresentation to a marriage agency, constituted evidence of her instability, and that her person and property were to be remanded to the custody of her legal guardian, her father, Robert Hawthorne, pending formal review. And attached to that filing was a second document, a sworn statement from Robert Hawthorne asserting that his daughter had been taken advantage of by an unscrupulous Western rancher and that her presence in Wyoming territory was not of her own free volition. Gideon read that last part twice. "Your father is claiming I took you against your will," he said. "Yes. Which means the kidnapping charge is attached to you, not to anyone coming to retrieve me." She straightened up and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall behind it. "This is what they prepared while I was still in St. Louis. This was the contingency if I ran. Not just to bring me back, to make bringing me back look like rescue." The kitchen was very quiet, except for the coffee starting to bubble on the stove. "They've also prepared the ground here," she said. "Braddock spent yesterday morning making the rounds. By now every person in this valley has heard that I'm unstable and that you've been deceived. When the legal documents reached town—" "They already did," Gideon said. "The deputy had 2 envelopes. He delivered here first." She turned to look at him. "The sheriff has a copy," he said. Something moved across her face, not despair, not panic, something worse than both of those because it was so controlled. The recognition of a person who has seen this mechanism before and understands exactly how it works and knows how hard it is to stop once it's in motion. "Then we have today," she said. "Maybe less." "What do we need?" She pulled out the chair and sat down, and the movement had a deliberateness to it. She was not sitting because she was tired. She was sitting because she needed to think properly, and she thought better when she was still. "Sutton," she said, "the lawyer you telegraphed in Laramie, has he responded?" "Not yet. I sent the inquiry 2 days ago. Land records take time to pull." "We need him faster than that. The filing in Laramie County will reach a local judge within a day or 2. If a local judge accepts the competency determination, they can issue a writ and the sheriff will be legally obligated to act on it." She looked at Gideon. "Purdy won't want to, but a writ is a writ." "What does Sutton need to block it?" "A counterfiling. Evidence that the original competency determination was fraudulent. And it was, because no actual hearing was ever held. My father and Pruitt generated paperwork to look like a hearing, but there's no transcript, no witnesses, no record of me being present, because I wasn't. I was told to sign a paper agreeing to the marriage arrangement or face legal consequences, and I refused and left. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose, just briefly. The problem is that proving fraud requires documentation, and the documentation that most directly supports my position is sitting in the hands of whoever stole it from this room 2 nights ago. Or with Margaret Doyle. Or with Margaret Doyle, she said, who we haven't found yet. Gideon stood up and went to the stove and poured the coffee, because the silence needed something practical in it. I'm going to ride into town, he said. I'm going to telegraph Sutton directly and ask him to drop everything else. I'm going to tell him what we're dealing with and what we need and ask him to come in person if he has to. He set a cup in front of her. And I'm going to talk to Thomas Greer, the feed store man. He's been in this valley longer than Braddock. He knows every family on the range. If Margaret Doyle has family in Colorado, if there's any connection that runs through here, Greer will know a name. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. And if he won't help, if Braddock has gotten to him, then I'll know where Greer stands and we'll move on to the next person. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm coming with you. Evelyn, don't, she said, not sharply, just firmly. Don't tell me to stay here because it's safer. Staying here and waiting is exactly what they want me to do. It makes me look like I'm hiding, and hiding looks like guilt, and they will use that. She met his eyes. I need to be visible, Gideon. I need the people in this town to see me standing upright and not running. He thought about that. He thought about Braddock's circuit of the main street yesterday morning, planting the story while Evelyn was at the ranch, and what it would have cost her not to be there to offer a different version. All right, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's the right call and I should have thought of it myself. She almost smiled at that. Almost. They were halfway to Reed Valley when the riders appeared. There were 3 of them, coming down the North Ridge Road at a pace that was not hurried but was not casual either. The pace of men who had somewhere specific to be and had timed their arrival. They rode in a loose formation, and the man in the center was someone Gideon had not seen before, which in this county, after 12 years, meant something. He was lean, 40-something, with a face that had been outside for most of its life, and had the particular weathered quality that came from sustained alertness rather than just sun and wind. He rode with his hands very easy on the reins, which was the opposite of relaxed. It was the posture of a man who kept his hands available. Evelyn saw him and went rigid beside Gideon on the wagon seat, a single breath of tension so controlled that he only caught it because he'd been watching her for 3 days and had started to understand her physical vocabulary. Kincaid, she said. Just the one word. And quiet. Kincaid raised a hand as they drew level. Not a wave, a signal to stop. The kind of gesture that assumed compliance. Gideon did not stop. He slowed the wagon to a walk and kept it moving, and Kincaid's horse sidestepped to block the road, which was the next escalation. Gideon stopped the wagon. Silas Kincaid, Evelyn said before anyone else could speak. Her voice was clear and steady and pitched for carrying. I wondered when you'd come yourself. Kincaid looked at her with the mild, measuring expression of a man who had learned long ago that showing reactions was inefficient. Miss Hawthorne, there's a legal matter that needs to be resolved. There are several, she said. Which one are you here about? The competency filing. And the kidnapping claim, she said. Yes, I read it this morning. Would you like to hear how many things in it are false? This isn't a conversation I need to have on a road, Kincaid said. Mr. Caldwell has asked me to escort you to Cheyenne where the matter can be handled by the appropriate. Vincent Caldwell has no legal authority over me, she said. Not yet. Not until a court in the relevant jurisdiction has accepted the filing, which has not happened. Until that time, I am a free woman in Wyoming territory, and you are blocking a public road. Kincaid looked at Gideon. You're Mercer. I am. You understand there are serious charges attached to your name in those documents. I've read them, Gideon said. They're false. That's for a court to determine. Then I look forward to the court. Gideon held the man's gaze. Are you going to move your horse, or are we going to sit here on a public road until someone explains to a judge why a tracker employed by an interested party is physically preventing citizens from traveling? A beat. Something moved in Kincaid's face, not anger, more like a recalibration. He moved his horse. This isn't finished, he said, as the wagon passed. I know, Evelyn said, without turning around. It hasn't really started yet. They rode the remaining distance to Reed Valley, in a silence that had the tight, careful quality of people who have just crossed a line and are thinking about what comes next. Gideon felt the back of his neck prickle the whole way, which was the physical evidence of knowing 3 men were behind them on the road and choosing not to look back. "He'll go to Purdy," Evelyn said. "He has the paperwork and he'll present it formally and ask the sheriff to enforce. How long before Purdy has to act on it? Depends on the judge. If Braddock has already arranged for a local judge to be cooperative, it could be hours." Gideon processed that. "Then we have hours," he said. The main street of Reed Valley had a different character than it had 3 days ago. It was fuller, more people than a Friday morning usually warranted. And the fullness had a quality to it, a stillness beneath the movement, the way a crowd goes quiet when everyone is listening to something no one is saying aloud. Gideon drove the wagon to the telegraph office first. He went in and sent 2 telegrams, one to Sutton in Laramie marked urgent, with a brief account of the legal situation and a request for the fastest possible response, and one to a contact in Denver, asking for any information on a woman named Anna Cole, married to a man in the mining equipment trade, sister of a former domestic worker named Margaret Doyle. He sent them and came out and found Evelyn on the sidewalk, standing with Thomas Greer. Not hiding, not quietly talking by the wagon. Standing on the sidewalk in clear view of the street, talking to Greer directly. And Greer had the expression of a man who was listening more carefully than he'd planned to. Gideon crossed to them. "Documents are dated before she arrived," Greer was saying, half to himself. That's not right." "It's not," Evelyn said, "because a legitimate competency hearing requires the person to be present. I was never present. There was never a hearing. The paperwork was manufactured to look like one." Greer looked at Gideon. "Is this true?" "The dates are in the documents themselves," Gideon said. "You can read them." "And the land claim," Greer said. "Silver Creek Spring. If her mother filed—" "She did," Evelyn said. "And I can prove the filing is legitimate if I can obtain the supporting documentation. My mother's housekeeper has copies." "Where is she?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Evelyn said. Greer pulled at his jaw the way he had 2 days ago, the same gesture, the same man working through something he'd rather not have to work through. He looked down the street and then back at them. "Frank Hollis," he said. "He runs the post office on Meridian. Came here 3 years ago from Colorado. His wife is originally from Denver. She might know the Cole family, if they're in the mining supply trade. It's not much." "It's something," Evelyn said. "Thank you, Thomas." Greer looked at her for a moment, the look of a man revising an initial judgment. "Braddock was in here again this morning," he said, "before you arrived. He said there was going to be a legal action taken today." "There will be," she said. "There are 2 sides to it." Greer nodded slowly. He looked at the street again, at the people moving through it, at the general population of Reed Valley going about a Friday that had more than the usual amount of watching in it. "I sell feed to 11 families on this range," he said, apparently to no one in particular. 7 of them have access to Silver Creek water through Braddock's arrangement. If the spring reverts to legitimate ownership—" He stopped. Well, that changes a great deal." He went back into his store. Evelyn looked at Gideon. "He's thinking about whether the honest thing and the practical thing are the same thing," she said. "Are they?" "If my claim holds up, the water arrangement he's worried about stays the same. I told you I'd protect access for honest families." She looked at the feed store door. "He just hasn't heard that part yet." "Then let's make sure he does," Gideon said, "before Kincaid gets to Purdy." Frank Hollis's wife was named Ruth, and she was originally from a neighborhood of Denver that she described with the specific pride of a person who had worked hard to get out of it, and she knew the Cole family with the immediacy of someone who had gone to church with the wife for 11 years before leaving the territory. "Anna Cole," Ruth said when Evelyn described her. She was standing in the post office back room, a small woman with her sleeves rolled up, sorting mail with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing the same task for years. "Anna Doyle before she married. Yes, I know her, or I knew her. It's been 3 years since I left Denver." "Do you have an address?" Evelyn said. She was keeping her voice measured, but her hands had gone still at her sides, which Gideon had learned was her physical indicator of something that mattered. "Not a current one. They were on Larimer Street when I left. The warehouse district, East End. Her husband ran a small equipment brokerage out of a building near the rail yard." Ruth set down the mail she was holding. Anna's sister used to visit. Quiet woman, older, white hair. I remember her because she always brought a small notebook and wrote things in it. Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. That's Margaret, she said. Is she in trouble? She might be, Evelyn said, or she will be if certain people find her before I do. Ruth Hollis looked between them. She had the practical intelligence of a woman who had managed a post office in a frontier town and had learned to read situations quickly. I'll write down what I remember, she said. The address may not be current, but in a district that small, the neighbors would know where they moved to. That would help enormously, Evelyn said. Ruth wrote it down. She handed the paper to Evelyn with the no-ceremony efficiency of someone who did useful things because they needed doing. If Margaret Doyle is carrying documents that need protecting, Ruth said, she should know that a tracker named Kincaid came through Denver about a week ago. My sister wrote me. He was asking questions in the warehouse district. The air in the back room changed. Evelyn held the paper and said very carefully, how specific were the questions? She didn't know, just that he was asking about a woman with white hair who kept a notebook. Ruth met her eyes. I didn't know what it meant when my sister wrote it. Now I think I do. Evelyn looked at Gideon. He was already moving toward the door. I'll send the telegram from the office right now. Denver contact, specific address, find her today. Gideon. She caught him at the door, the same hand on his sleeve as before, the same light touch. If Kincaid already has the address, then we need to move faster than he does, he said, which is still possible. Go. She went. He went. They were crossing the main street at a near run when they heard Braddock's voice. He was on the sidewalk outside his office, not shouting. Braddock never needed to shout. He had the kind of voice that carried through crowds by weight rather than volume. And he was talking to a group of 4 men, ranchers from the look of them, who were listening with the body language of people being told something that aligned with their fear. Woman has papers filed against her in 2 territories, Braddock was saying. Mercer has been named as party to the fraud. You want to do business with a man the law is already looking at? I've told you for 3 years that spring access was conditional, and it was conditional on you keeping the terms of the arrangement, Gideon said. He said it loudly enough and clearly enough that the words landed on the sidewalk before Braddock had finished his sentence. The 4 ranchers turned. Several other people on the street turned. Braddock looked at him, then at Evelyn. Mercer, Braddock said, this isn't the place. You chose the place, Gideon said, walking toward him. He kept his pace even, not aggressive, not hurried, just direct. You chose the main street on a Friday morning. You chose an audience. All right, let's use the audience. He stopped at the edge of the group. The legal filing you've been telling everyone about was dated 11 days before Miss Hawthorne arrived in Reed Valley, he said to the ranchers, not to Braddock. 11 days before, which means the hearing it claims to document happened while she was still in St. Louis. He let that sit. A hearing she was never present for, because there was no hearing. The papers are manufactured. One of the ranchers, a weathered man named Ben Cutter, who had been in the valley nearly as long as Gideon, said, "How do you know that?" Because the paperwork documents her. It has dates and signatures and official language. What it doesn't have is a transcript, a witness list, or a notation of the subject's presence, because you can't document something that didn't happen. Gideon looked at Braddock. And the man who arranged those papers, Judge Harlan Pruitt, out of St. Louis, is associated with Vincent Caldwell, who wants ownership of a land claim that includes Silver Creek Spring. The silence on the sidewalk was comprehensive. That's a serious accusation, Braddock said. His voice was even. His eyes were not. It's a factual sequence of events, Gideon said. Here's another one. 3 nights ago, your man Roy Purcell burned my barn, and a second man broke into my house and stole legal documents belonging to Miss Hawthorne. Roy Purcell is currently sitting in the sheriff's jail. I'd like to know where the second man is. I don't know what your... Purcell named you, Gideon said. Last night, in front of witnesses. Ben Cutter was looking at Braddock with an expression that was doing quiet, significant work. Horace, Cutter said slowly, is any of this true? It's a desperate man's attempt to muddy. I'm going to stop you there, Evelyn said. She stepped forward and she had something in her hand, a folded paper, which she held up so the ranchers could see it. This is a copy of my mother's original land filing for Silver Creek Spring, she said. dated 1861, registered with the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. I obtained this copy from the office in Laramie 2 weeks ago, before I left for Reed Valley, before anyone knew I was coming here, before Braddock had a chance to arrange for its disappearance. She looked at Braddock directly. You've been drawing water from my mother's spring for 3 years on the basis of a fraudulent purchase from a man who didn't own it to sell. That man is my father. And when this is fully documented in court, every arrangement you've made based on that purchase is void. Braddock's face did something complicated. That paper means nothing without the supporting chain of title, he said. And those documents were stolen from my room 2 nights ago? Yes, she said. But copies exist. She said it with a certainty that was almost entirely real. Mostly real. Real enough. Something went through Braddock's eyes, a rapid calculation, a threat assessment. You don't have those copies, he said. Not yet, she said. I will. The moment that followed was the kind of moment that could have gone several directions and went none of them, because Sheriff Purdy came around the corner of the hardware store with Silas Kincaid behind him, and a piece of paper in his hand, and everyone on the sidewalk saw it, and the calculation in the crowd shifted. Purdy looked at the gathered group with the expression of a man who had walked into a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. He found Gideon. Gideon, he said, I need a word. Go ahead. In private. Thomas Greer is standing right there, Gideon said, without looking. Ben Cutter is standing there. Ruth Hollis came out of the post office 10 seconds ago. These are the people in this valley. Whatever you need to say to me, you can say it in front of them, because it affects them. Purdy stopped. He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Kincaid. He looked at Evelyn. The filing from Laramie County, he said. A local judge has been asked to consider the competency order. Which judge? Gideon said. Purdy hesitated. Judge Kellerman. Ben Cutter said flatly, Kellerman has been in Braddock's pocket for 2 years, and everyone in this valley knows it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Heavier, more permanent. Purdy looked at Cutter. I can't speak to that, Purdy said. No, Cutter said. I don't suppose you can. Kincaid stepped forward. Sheriff, the legal authority here is not determined by who arrives first with a piece of paper, Evelyn said. She turned to face Kincaid directly. You followed me from St. Louis. You sent men ahead to steal documents from this ranch. You had Horace Braddock burn Gideon Mercer's barn as a distraction while those documents were taken. She looked at Purdy. I am asking you formally, as a citizen of this territory, to investigate those acts. I'm asking you to request the documentation of the competency hearing from the filing court and verify that the proceedings occurred as described. And I am telling you that if you choose to enforce that order without doing those things first, you will be enforcing a fraud. The street was very quiet. Kincaid said to Purdy, She's doing exactly what the filing predicted, creating confusion to obstruct. The filing predicted this, Evelyn said, because they wrote it knowing I would object. Because the correct response to a fraudulent legal action is objection. That's not evidence of instability. That's evidence of a person who knows she's being wronged. Ben Cutter said, Dale. His voice was quiet and carried the particular weight of a man who had known the sheriff for 20 years. You know this woman has been in this valley 3 days. You know Braddock has been working it for 3 years. You know which one of them built their case before the other one arrived. Purdy stood on the sidewalk with his paper and his conscience and about 30 pairs of eyes on him. He folded the paper. I'm going to request verification of the original hearing documentation, he said. Until I receive it, I'm not in a position to enforce an order based on proceedings I can't confirm occurred. He looked at Kincaid. You're welcome to remain in Reed Valley. You're not welcome to take any action against Miss Hawthorne or Mr. Mercer while I'm conducting that verification. Kincaid's face went through several things. You'll hear from the Caldwell attorneys, he said. I expect so, Purdy said. He didn't sound particularly frightened by it. Braddock had said nothing for the past several minutes. He was watching Evelyn with an expression that had cleared of all its performed confidence and settled into something colder and more deliberate. It was the expression of a man revising his plan. It was more frightening than the confident version. She felt it and didn't look away from him. He turned and went back into his building without a word. The crowd dispersed the way crowds did when the immediate tension broke, gradually, with a lot of quiet side conversation. And Gideon put his hand briefly on Evelyn's shoulder as they walked back toward the telegraph office to check for Sutton's response. "That was well done," he said. "I don't know if it was," she said. Braddock didn't argue. When men like Braddock stop arguing in public, it's because they've decided on something worse. "I know. The filing in Laramie. If Kellerman decides to accept it anyway, then we deal with that when it happens. Gideon, they could take me by Evelyn." He said it quietly, on the sidewalk, with people moving past them. "One thing at a time. Right now, Purdy is buying us time. Sutton may have a response. Your Denver contact may have found Margaret." He looked at her. "You did something on that sidewalk that I don't think you've been able to do in a long time." She waited. "You made people uncertain," he said. "Not convinced, yet, but uncertain. And uncertain people can still be moved." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that," she said, "that the most important moment in any argument wasn't when people agreed with you. It was when they first stopped being certain you were wrong." She was right. She usually was. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't, and he heard it. The telegraph office had a response from Sutton waiting. The lawyer had pulled the land records. Caroline Hawthorne's filing was intact, registered, and legally sound. The chain of title was clear. He was preparing a counterfiling to the competency order and could be in Reed Valley within 3 days. 3 days. Gideon read the telegram and thought about what 3 days meant and what could happen inside them. He sent a reply confirming, "Come as fast as you can. Things are moving." Outside, the October sun was dropping toward the western ridge, and somewhere in the direction of Silver Creek, a hawk was working the thermals in long, patient circles, watching the ground below with the particular attention of something that had learned to wait for the right moment. Gideon watched it for a few seconds. He was going to need to search the property again tonight. Braddock's silence on that sidewalk was sitting in him like a stone, dense and specific, and he trusted it the way he trusted a sky that looked clear but felt wrong. Something was coming. He just didn't know yet from which direction it would arrive. The night passed without incident, which Gideon did not trust. He rode the perimeter twice, once at 10, once at 2 in the morning, and found nothing, no shapes in the tree line, no lantern light in the meadow, no sound that didn't belong to the creek and the wind and the usual language of the dark. The horses were settled, the corral held, the damaged barn corner open to the sky like a missing tooth. Nothing. Which meant either Braddock had pulled back to regroup, or he had moved to a different kind of action that didn't require anyone to be on Gideon's land in the dark. Gideon came inside at 3 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table and thought about which of those two possibilities was more dangerous. He concluded it was the second one, which meant the danger was already in motion somewhere he couldn't see it, which was the worst kind. He was still at the table when Evelyn came out at 5:30, already dressed, and she looked at him, and at the cold lamp, and at the coffee that had been sitting untouched long enough to be room temperature. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Some." She looked at the coffee. "That's a lie." "A partial one." He straightened. "Nothing on the perimeter. No movement. Clean night." "That concerns you." "Yes." She went to the stove and rebuilt the fire and put fresh coffee on without being asked, which was the action of a person who understood that the conversation needed a few practical minutes before it could carry weight. He watched her move through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had located every necessary thing on the first day and remembered where it was. "Braddock was thinking on that sidewalk yesterday," she said, with her back to him. "He made a decision. I know. He won't try force again. Not directly. Not with Purdy having already publicly declined to enforce the order." She turned. "He'll work the legal angle. Try to get Kellerman to move before Sutton arrives." 3 days, Gideon said. "Maybe less, if Sutton pushes." She poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat down across from him. "And there's the Denver situation. If Kincaid already had an address for Margaret—" "My contact there is fast," Gideon said. "The telegram went out yesterday. If Anna Cole is where Ruth Hollis remembers, he'll have found her within the day. And if Kincaid's people found her first." Neither of them finished that sentence. There was no version of the end of it that was useful to say aloud. Evelyn wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside, the early light was just beginning to define the edges of things. The corral post, the creek line, the far ridge. That brief interval when everything was still in outline before detail arrived. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I was reading those legal documents yesterday, the competency filing," she looked at her cup. "My father's sworn statement. I've read documents from him before. Official letters, correspondence, legal papers. I know his voice in writing." She paused. "That statement wasn't written by my father." Gideon was quiet. "He signed it," she said. "His signature is genuine. I've seen it enough times to know. But the language, the structure of the argument, the specific way the mental incompetence was framed, that's Vincent Caldwell's work. Or his lawyer's. My father signed what he was handed." She looked up. "He didn't even write his own accusation. He just put his name on theirs. Does that change anything legally?" "It might. It goes to the question of whether the filing represents my father's genuine testimony or whether he was acting under direction. If Sutton can establish that my father was effectively coerced into signing..." She stopped. "But it also tells me something else." "Your father isn't in control of this," Gideon said. "He hasn't been for a long time. He thought he was making a deal with Vincent. He thought he was selling my marriage in exchange for his debts. But Vincent used that arrangement to get access to my mother's estate, and my father is now in a position where he has to keep signing whatever Vincent hands him, because if this unravels, my father goes down with it." She said it without heat, without grief, just the flat assessment of a person who had worked through the emotional portion of this knowledge at some earlier point and arrived at the far side of it. "He's not my enemy. He's Vincent's instrument." "Does that make it easier?" She thought about it honestly. "No, but it makes it clearer." He nodded. He understood the difference between those two things. The coffee was good. Outside, the light was coming on fully now, the detail filling in, the texture of the yard, the color of the hills, the particular shade of Wyoming October sky that had no equivalent anywhere else he'd ever been. "Today," he said. "Today," she agreed. The telegram from Denver arrived at 9:15 in the morning. Gideon was in the telegraph office when it came through, having ridden into town alone at first light while Evelyn stayed at the ranch to meet Ben Cutter, who had sent word the night before that he wanted to talk. Gideon had gone through a brief internal argument about leaving her alone and then remembered who he was having it about and left. The telegram was from his contact, a man named Percy Oakes, who had the distinction of being both extremely reliable and extremely terse in written communication. It read, "Found A. Cole. Larimer East End. Sister M. present. Leave immediately advised. Kincaid man was there Thursday. They hid. Safe for now. Send word." Gideon read it twice, then a third time. Margaret Doyle was in Denver. She was alive. She had hidden from Kincaid's man, which meant she knew she was being sought. And Percy was advising immediate departure, which meant he believed the situation was not stable. He sent a reply in 40 seconds. "Arrange travel. Laramie first. Contact lawyer Sutton. I'll send letter of introduction. Bring everything she has." He sent a second telegram to Sutton directly. "Woman with documents arriving from Denver. Name Margaret Doyle. Protect her. Everything depends on what she carries." Then he rode back to the ranch faster than he'd ridden out. Evelyn was sitting on the porch steps when he came through the gate, and Ben Cutter's horse was tied at the rail, and through the front window he could see Cutter inside at the kitchen table. Evelyn stood when she saw Gideon's pace. He told her about the telegram before he'd fully dismounted. She stood very still while he spoke. When he finished, she sat back down on the porch steps, which was the most undone he'd seen her, and put her face in her hands for about 4 seconds. Then she took them away and looked at him. "She's alive," Evelyn said. "She's alive, and she's got the documents. She hid from Kincaid's man. She knew he was coming. Apparently. She's been protecting those papers. This whole time she's been..." She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, and it was not a gesture of grief exactly, but close to something that had grief in it. "My mother chose well. When she chose Margaret." "She did," Gideon said simply. He gave her 10 seconds and then said, "Cutter." She pulled herself together with the particular efficiency of a person who had long practice at it. "He wants to help. He's been talking to the other ranchers, 4 families on the East Range who draw water from the Silver Creek arrangement. They're worried. If the spring ownership is contested and Braddock's purchase is voided, they need to know what happens to their access. What did you tell him? That I intend to honor access for every honest family in this valley, regardless of how the title resolves. She looked at him. I told him I'd put it in writing. Gideon thought about that. It was a significant offer. It was also, he realized, exactly the right one, not just strategically, but genuinely. He believe you? He said. He's inside drinking your coffee and thinking about it, she said, which is further than he was an hour ago. They went inside. Cutter was a rancher of 60, weathered in the specific way of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions about land and weather and livestock and had accepted that most of them would be imperfect. He had the careful eyes of someone who had been lied to enough times to have developed a reliable system for testing what he was told. He looked at Gideon when he came in. You got news. Margaret Doyle is in Denver. She's safe. She's moving toward Laramie with documents. Cutter absorbed that. Documents. Copies of my mother's full land filing, Evelyn said. Documentation of the fraudulent transactions my father arranged. Letters establishing the timeline. She sat down across from him. Enough to establish the full picture in front of a court. Braddock know? Not yet, Gideon said. That's the window. Cutter turned his cup on the table. It was an old habit, a thinking gesture. Kellerman has been asked to review the competency order. Word is he's planning to act on it by tomorrow morning. Evelyn looked at Gideon. How do you know? Gideon said. Because Kellerman told my wife at the dry goods store yesterday afternoon. He's a man who likes people to know he has authority. He said there was a filing being reviewed and it would be settled by morning. Cutter's voice was dry in the way of someone reporting a fact they find contemptible. He said it the way a man says something he wants repeated. So Braddock knows the timeline, Evelyn said. Yes. And if Kellerman issues a writ tomorrow morning, Purdy told me himself he can't hold the line past a formal writ, Cutter said. He'll enforce it. He's not a bad man. He's a man with limits. He looked at Evelyn. You need to be somewhere Kellerman's writ can't reach you by morning, or you need to have something that makes the writ invalid before it's issued. Sutton, Gideon said. 3 days, you said. Maybe less. Margaret is moving now. If she reaches Laramie today and Sutton can review what she has tonight, he can file the counter before Kellerman acts, Evelyn said. Her voice had the quality of a person doing rapid arithmetic. If Sutton files in Laramie County by morning, Kellerman can't proceed without a review process. It slows everything down. It needs to happen today, Cutter said. I know, Gideon said. Cutter stood up. He was not a tall man, but he had the posture of someone who had never learned to make himself smaller. I'm going to talk to Jim Reardon and Frank Walsh. They draw from Silver Creek. They need to know what's actually happening, not what Braddock has been telling them. He picked up his hat. I can't promise they'll act on it, but they should know the truth. That's all we're asking, Evelyn said. Cutter looked at her with the revising expression that several people in Reed Valley had been arriving at in the past 2 days. Your mother filed that claim in 1861, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Before I was born, she said. She wanted me to have something that was mine and couldn't be taken. She just didn't anticipate how hard they'd work to take it anyway. Cutter put his hat on. I'll see what I can do, he said, and went out. At noon, Vincent Caldwell rode into Reed Valley. Gideon heard about it from Thomas Greer, who came out to the ranch in person rather than send word by the usual channels, which told Gideon how seriously he was taking the information. Arrived on the noon stage from Cheyenne, Greer said. He was standing in the yard, turning his hat in his hands. 3 men with him, not working men, the kind that wear good coats and carry papers. Lawyers, Evelyn said. She had come out of the house when she heard the horse. That would be my read. Greer looked at her. He went straight to Braddock's office. They've been in there an hour. Kellerman too? Gideon said. Not yet, but give it time. Gideon looked at the sky. Midday light, high and flat, the kind that made distances hard to read. Vincent's presence changes things, Evelyn said. Her voice was careful. He won't have come himself unless he's decided that the legal and proxy approach isn't moving fast enough. He'll want to present himself directly, as the concerned party, the wronged fiancé, the man trying to rescue a woman from a difficult situation. She looked at Gideon. He's very good at that. at appearing to be the reasonable one. What does he actually want? Greer asked. His lawyer's to get in front of Kellerman today, she said. Not tomorrow morning, today, before Sutton can counter anything. If he can get a writ issued this afternoon, then tonight, Gideon said. The weight of that settled over the yard. I need to get to the telegraph office, Gideon said. I'll go, Greer said unexpectedly. Tell me what to send. Gideon looked at him. Greer met the look without flinching. I've been selling feed in this valley for 15 years. I've watched Braddock squeeze 3 families off their land and buy out 2 others at prices that weren't prices at all. I kept my head down because I had a business to protect. He paused. I have a business to protect now, too. I'd rather it be in a valley where the water belongs to the people who earned it. He said it plainly and without drama, which made it land harder. Gideon told him what to send. Sutton first. Caldwell arrived Reed Valley. Move everything forward, today if possible. Percy Oaks in Denver. Second, fastest possible route to Laramie. Tell Margaret, today matters. Greer repeated it back correctly and went to his horse. Thomas, Evelyn said. He turned. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and rode. What happened next happened fast, the way things do when pressure has been building in a confined space and several forces reach the same point at the same moment. Kincaid came to the ranch at 2 in the afternoon, not alone. He had 2 men with him, and he had a piece of paper, and he had the manner of a man who had been waiting for a formal authority to arrive and had now received one. He presented himself at the gate and called for Gideon, who came out to the fence line and stood on his side of it. Kellerman signed, Kincaid said. He held up the paper. This afternoon, a writ requiring the temporary custodial transfer of Evelyn Hawthorne to the legal authority of her guardian, Robert Hawthorne, pending the full hearing of the competency matter in the court of record. Gideon did not move. Purdy is on his way, Kincaid said. I'm notifying you in advance as a courtesy. The transfer will be conducted lawfully and without— Where is she supposed to go? Gideon said. Cheyenne, there's— With you. With the authorized party. Vincent Caldwell. Kincaid didn't confirm or deny. The writ names her father as— Her father is in St. Louis, Gideon said. Vincent Caldwell is in Reed Valley. You tell me which one actually authorized this. Kincaid's expression did its careful non-reaction. The legal authority is clear. The legal authority is a writ signed by a judge with a documented financial relationship with the man who wants this woman's property. I'm going to ask you to wait while I send a telegraph to the Laramie County Court to confirm the counterfiling status. I'm not required to— No, Gideon said. You're not required to do anything decent, but I'm asking you to. Kincaid looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the fence. You have 1 hour, he said. Then Purdy will be here, and this proceeds by the law. Gideon went inside. Evelyn was at the kitchen table. She had heard everything through the front window, which she had opened 2 inches, and her expression told him she had processed it faster than he had. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour. Sutton can't have received my message yet, even if he moves tonight. We need to buy another day, Gideon said. He stood in the kitchen with his hat still on, thinking with the particular speed of a man who has been backed against a specific wall before and knows the geometry. If we go to town, they'll take me. Not if there's a public dispute. Not if Cutter and Greer and enough people are there to see it happen and ask questions. He looked at her. Purdy doesn't want to do this. I know Dale Purdy. He'll move slowly if there's community resistance. Every minute he delays is a minute Sutton has. Evelyn stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the gate where Kincaid and his men were waiting with a patience that was itself a kind of pressure. If we go into town and I'm taken anyway, she said. If Kincaid has enough legal cover and Purdy has no choice, then we make sure every person in that town sees exactly how it happens. Who gave the order? Whose lawyers wrote the writ? Whose money is behind the writ? He moved to stand beside her at the window. Visibility is what you said yourself. It's the only weapon we have while the legal side catches up. She was quiet for 30 seconds. He let her take them. All right, she said, but I need 5 minutes. She went to the room off the kitchen. He heard her moving. She came out with her carpet bag, which he thought at first was an alarming sign, and then she opened it and showed him what was inside. Not clothes, not the personal items she'd arrived with. A set of documents, copies he could see from the paper quality, but careful copies made in a controlled hand. "I had these made in Laramie," she said, "before I came here. The same morning I obtained the copy of the land filing. I gave you that one. These," she held up several folded papers, "are copies of my mother's last 3 communications to Margaret Doyle. Not the full documentation that Margaret has, but enough to establish a pattern of intent, enough to show that my mother was actively protecting a specific inheritance and that the mechanism of that protection involved Margaret as a custodian." Gideon looked at the papers. "That's not nothing," he said. "It's not enough to win," she said, "but it's enough to make Kellerman's writ look hasty if it's presented to the right person before the transfer happens. Sutton. Or any lawyer willing to look at it for 5 minutes." She closed the bag. "Is there a lawyer in Reed Valley?" "Arthur Finch. He's mostly wills and property disputes. He's also the one man in this valley Braddock has never managed to put on his payroll, which tells you something about Finch's stubbornness." "Then we go see Finch," she said. "On the way." They rode into Reed Valley with Kincaid's party, following at a distance that was legally correct and practically threatening, and the street that met them was different from every other time they had come into town in the past 4 days. Cutter was there. Reardon and Walsh were there, the 2 ranchers Cutter had said he would speak to. Ruth Hollis was there, and beside her a woman Gideon didn't recognize until Evelyn made a sound beside him that was not quite a word. The woman was small, white-haired. She stood on the sidewalk outside the sheriff's office in traveling clothes that had not been changed in at least 24 hours, and she was holding a small blue notebook against her chest with both hands, as if it were the most important object in the world. Because it was. "Margaret," Evelyn said, and her voice broke on the single word in a way that nothing else in 4 days of sustained pressure had managed to break it. She was down from the wagon before it fully stopped, and she crossed the sidewalk, and Margaret Doyle opened her arms and held her the way a woman holds someone she has known since that person was a child. Not gently, but firmly, the grip of a person who means it. Gideon sat in the wagon and watched and felt something go loose in his chest that had been tight since the night of the barn fire. Margaret pulled back and held Evelyn's face in both hands. "I came as fast as I could," Margaret said. Her voice was low and certain. "I've been carrying these for 4 years waiting for the right moment. I believe this is it." "How did you get here so fast?" Evelyn said. "The telegram only went yesterday." "I left Denver 3 days ago," Margaret said. "When the man came asking questions in the warehouse district, I knew what it meant. I took the next available coach to Laramie and was already there when the telegram arrived." She pulled back. "I met a lawyer named Sutton at the Laramie station. He had the same telegram you sent him. We spent the night reviewing everything." "Sutton is here?" Gideon said. "He arrived this morning," Margaret said. She looked at Gideon directly. "You're Mercer." It was not a question. "I am." "Caroline spoke about your land." "Not you." "She didn't know you. But she spoke about the creek and the bench land and the kind of ranch a good person might build there." She looked at him steadily. "I think she would have approved of this." Gideon had no response that was adequate for that sentence, so he said nothing, which Margaret seemed to understand. Kincaid had pulled up his horse at the end of the street. His 2 men were behind him. They were watching the sidewalk in front of the sheriff's office and doing the same rapid arithmetic that everyone else was doing. Vincent Caldwell came out of Braddock's office. He was not what Gideon had expected, which was either a sign that Gideon's expectations needed adjusting, or that Vincent had worked very hard to not be what anyone expected. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed, with the kind of even-featured face that read as reasonable from a distance and something else up close. He crossed the street toward the sheriff's office, with his lawyers flanking him in the expression of a man arriving to handle a regrettable situation. He saw Margaret Doyle and stopped walking. It was a small stop, a single broken stride. And then he resumed. But Gideon caught it, and Evelyn caught it, and from the way Cutter shifted beside Gideon, Cutter caught it too. "Miss Hawthorne," Vincent said when he reached the sidewalk. His voice was calm, practiced. "I'm relieved you're safe. We've all been very concerned." "I'm sure," Evelyn said. His eyes went to Margaret. "Mrs. Doyle." His voice remained level. "I wasn't aware you were in the territory." "I'm aware you weren't," Margaret said. She had not moved from her position beside Evelyn. The blue notebook was still in her hands. Purdy came out of the sheriff's office. He had the look of a man who had been inside hoping this situation would simplify itself, and had discovered it had done the opposite. Dale, Gideon said. Sutton is here. Before any writ is enforced, he needs 60 minutes with Kellerman. The writ is all ready, one of Vincent's lawyers started. The writ is under contest, said a voice from the side of the building, and Edward Sutton came around the corner in traveling clothes with a leather satchel under his arm and the brisk manner of a man who had not slept enough and had decided not to let that matter. He went directly to Purdy. I filed a motion in Laramie County this morning contesting the competency order on procedural grounds, specifically the absence of any documented hearing. I also have, as of approximately 2 hours ago, the full supporting documentation for the original land filing for Silver Creek Spring, including correspondence establishing a fraudulent pattern of disposition by the claimant's agent. He looked at the lawyers. Any enforcement of that writ before the procedural contest is reviewed will be a nullifiable act. I suggest Judge Kellerman be informed of that before anyone makes a decision. They'll spend a long time explaining. The lawyer who had spoken looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at Sutton, then at Margaret, then at Evelyn. There was a moment that had the particular quality of a game where someone has turned over a card that changes all the other cards' value, and the man who is losing is working through whether there's any remaining move. Braddock chose that moment to arrive. He came from the direction of his office, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had been watching from a window and decided it was time. He looked at the assembled group on the sidewalk, the ranchers, the lawyer, the old housekeeper, the sheriff, and something in his face was calculating in the specific way of a man who has decided that the situation has gotten away from the careful approach and now requires the other kind. This is a private legal matter, Braddock said, to no one in particular and everyone specifically. And you, he looked at Margaret, are carrying documents that were removed from a private estate without authorization. I carried them with the explicit written authorization of their owner, Margaret said, Caroline Hawthorne, who gave them to me 4 years ago, who wrote that authorization in front of 2 witnesses whose names I have documented. She opened the blue notebook and looked at it, then at Braddock. Would you like the names? Braddock stared at her. Because I also have the record of the transaction your agent conducted with Robert Hawthorne in November of 1874, Margaret continued, her voice as steady as stone. The one where he sold access rights to Silver Creek Spring that he did not have legal authority to sell. The one that was conducted without Caroline Hawthorne's knowledge or consent, while she was ill, in her own house, at a table in a room 2 doors from where she was lying. She held his gaze. I was in the house. I heard the conversation. I wrote it down that night. I have it here. The sidewalk was very quiet. Braddock said, after a moment, You can't prove. She doesn't have to prove it today, Sutton said. She has to produce it. The proof happens in a court of law, which is where this is going. He looked at Purdy. Sheriff, I'm formally requesting that the writ be held pending the procedural review in Laramie County. I'm also asking that the documents in Mrs. Doyle's possession be treated as protected evidence relevant to an active legal filing. Purdy stood in the center of it all. He was a man with limits, as Cutter had said. He was also a man who could read a room, and the room currently included Cutter, Reardon, Walsh, Greer, and Ruth Hollis, all standing on the same side of an argument with an old woman holding a blue notebook that had just made Horace Braddock go pale. I'm holding the writ, Purdy said, pending review. One of Vincent's lawyers said sharply, I have the authority to determine the timing and conditions of enforcement, Purdy said, and I'm exercising it. He looked at Vincent. Mr. Caldwell, you're welcome in Reed Valley. You're not welcome to conduct a transfer of any person without my explicit authorization. Vincent looked at the lawyer. A long, silent exchange. Then Vincent said, very quietly, We'll see what the review produces. He turned and walked back toward Braddock's office, and his lawyers followed, and then it was just Braddock standing on the sidewalk for one more moment, looking at the group in front of him with the expression of a man who has made the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the ground has shifted in a way he didn't engineer and cannot immediately reverse. He looked at Gideon last. It was a look that said, This isn't finished. Gideon looked back and thought, I know, but it's different now. Braddock went inside. They gathered in the sheriff's main room, Gideon, Evelyn, Sutton, Margaret, Purdy, and Cutter, because Cutter had earned his place in the room and everyone knew it. The lawyers for Vincent had gone with their client, and Kincaid had ridden back toward Braddock's property, which Gideon noted and did not find reassuring. Sutton spread the documents on Purdy's desk and walked through them with the methodical speed of a man who had been reviewing them for 12 hours and could recite them by memory. The case was there. It was not simple, and it was not complete. There were gaps that required further filing and a court date that was not yet scheduled and legal processes that would take weeks and possibly months to fully resolve. But the essential architecture was sound. Caroline Hawthorne's land filing was valid. The transaction Robert Hawthorne had conducted in 1874 was unauthorized. The competency filing was procedurally defective in 4 distinct ways, and Margaret's documentation established a timeline of deliberate fraud going back a decade. Evelyn sat beside Margaret throughout and held the old woman's hand, and Margaret held hers, and neither of them spoke much because there was nothing that needed to be said in words. At the end, Sutton closed the satchel and looked at Purdy. "What I need from you," he said, "is a commitment to hold the writ until the Laramie review is complete, which gives us the time to prepare the full filing." "How long?" Purdy said. "A week, maybe less if the counterfiling is accepted quickly." Purdy thought. It was a visible, effortful thought, the kind that has real stakes at the end of it. "I can give you 4 days. After that, if there's no ruling from Laramie, my hands are going to be more tied than I'd like." 4 days is enough," Sutton said. But he glanced at Evelyn when he said it, and the glance had a question in it. She nodded. It would have to be. They came out of the sheriff's office into the late afternoon, the October sun cutting low and orange across the tops of the buildings, and the street had the quiet of a place where something significant had just happened and was still being absorbed. Gideon stood beside Evelyn on the sidewalk. Margaret was a few feet away, talking to Ruth Hollis, who had apparently identified a practical kinship with the older woman in the last 20 minutes. Cutter was at his horse, preparing to ride back. "It's not over," Evelyn said. "No. Braddock still has the stolen letters. Kincaid is still here. Vincent hasn't left." "All of that is true." Gideon looked out at the street, at the ordinary life of the town resuming itself around the edges of what had just happened. "But Margaret is here. Sutton is here. Purdy is holding the writ." She was quiet for a moment. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he said. She looked up at the ridge line where the light was going copper and long, and he watched her look at it. The particular way she looked at this landscape now, which was different from how she'd looked at the train platform 5 days ago. Still careful, still alert. But something underneath the alertness had shifted. Some posture of expecting the worst had given just slightly, just enough to be visible to a person who had been watching her carefully. "I need to find out where Braddock's going tonight," she said. He pulled his attention back. "Why?" "Because he didn't fight on that sidewalk. He didn't argue when Purdy held the writ. He went inside." She looked at Gideon. "Braddock doesn't accept things quietly. Not without planning what comes next. And the stolen letters are still missing." Gideon thought about it. "The creek," he said slowly. "The spring itself. If there's physical evidence at the site, that's what my mother's letters referenced," Evelyn said. "The filing marker. There's a physical marker at the spring source. A dated land marker my mother's surveyor placed in 1861. If that marker is destroyed, the physical record is gone," Gideon said, "and our legal case is significantly weaker." She looked at him. "He's going to the spring tonight. I'd bet everything on it." Gideon looked at the sky. Sunset in 2 hours. Kincaid riding back toward Braddock's property. "Then so are we," he said. They rode for Silver Creek as the last light went copper along the ridge. Gideon had told Cutter before they left town 2 quiet sentences by the man's horse while Evelyn was saying something to Margaret, and Cutter had listened and nodded and said he would bring Reardon and follow at a distance, not close enough to be part of whatever happened first, close enough to matter if it went bad. Purdy had been harder. Gideon had found him back in the office and told him directly, "Braddock is going to the spring tonight to destroy the physical marker, and if that happens, our legal case loses a critical piece." Purdy had looked at him with the expression of a man being asked to act on a prediction rather than a fact, which was not the kind of thing sheriffs were built for. "If I ride out there on a guess and nothing happens," Purdy said, "Braddock has grounds to file harassment against this office." "If you don't ride out there, and I'm right," Gideon said, "then the evidence is gone and the whole thing becomes your word against his in a court that already has Kellerman's fingerprints on it." Purdy had thought about it for 15 seconds. "I'll follow in an hour. That's the best I can do." An hour might be enough, Gideon said, and left before Purdy could change his mind. Now he and Evelyn rode north along the creek road in the early dark, not pushing the horses to a run, because running horses on an unfamiliar creek road in the dark was how you put a horse down and yourself with it, but moving at the fastest pace that was still careful. The creek ran beside them, lower than it would be in spring, but steady. That particular persistence of water that finds its level and holds it regardless of what happens on the land above. "You've been to the spring before?" Evelyn said. "Several times. Braddock's men used to patrol the access point. They stopped about 6 months ago, which I took as a sign they thought the legal paperwork had settled the question in their favor." "Where would the marker be?" "Your mother's surveyor would have placed it at the source point. There's a rock outcropping about 40 yards above where the spring emerges. That's the standard placement for a territorial filing marker." "Would Braddock know that?" "If he's had anyone look at the original filing, yes. The coordinates are in the document." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves on the packed earth were the loudest thing in the dark. "He didn't bring many men to town today, Kincaid and 2 others. Which means if he's going to the spring tonight, he's using whoever he has at the ranch." "Kincaid will be with him." "Yes." She didn't say anything else about that, but he felt the specific weight of the name settle between them. Kincaid was the variable that didn't resolve cleanly. A professional, careful man who operated inside the law when he could, and near its edges when he needed to, and who had been patient and systematic in a way that made him more dangerous than Roy Purcell's hired hand bluntness. The trail bent away from the creek and climbed through scrub and loose rock toward the bench above, and the horses slowed to pick their way, and Gideon let them take their time because the last thing he needed was noise. He smelled the torch before he saw the light, a particular combination of pine pitch and burning cloth, coming from upslope and to the left, where the rock outcropping would be. He pulled his horse to a stop, and Evelyn stopped beside him. "They're already there," she said, just above a whisper. 2 of them, at least. Maybe 3. He could see the light now. 2 sources, torches, moving with the purposeful motion of people working rather than traveling. "The marker," she said. "We need to see what they're doing before we move." They dismounted and tied the horses to scrub oak 20 feet off the trail and went the rest of the way on foot, moving upslope through the dark with the particular careful quiet of people who have learned in the past 5 days to trust each other's judgment about pace and silence. They came to the edge of the outcropping and looked down. Braddock was there. He was not working himself. Braddock was not the kind of man who did that. But he was standing with a torch in one hand and directing, which was its own kind of presence. Kincaid was crouched at the base of the rock face with a short iron bar, working at something in the stone. A third man stood watch at the downslope edge. The marker was still there. Gideon could see it from 30 feet. A bronze survey cap set into the rock face, stamped with the filing year and the claimant's initials. CH, 1861. It had been there for 17 years, through 4 Wyoming winters, and the slow, patient work of whoever had tried to pretend it didn't exist. Kincaid was trying to pry it out. He was making progress. Gideon looked at Evelyn. In the torchlight from 30 feet away, her face was completely readable. Not fear, not hesitation, the particular focused clarity of someone who has seen the one thing that cannot be allowed to happen and is calculating how to prevent it. "The watch," she said, barely audible. The third man, at the downslope edge, was facing away from them. "I can get to the marker," she said. "Evelyn, I can get there before Kincaid gets it out. The iron bar is working at the edge, but the cap is seated deep. I can see the angle he's using. He needs another 4 or 5 minutes." She looked at Gideon. "I know that rock. The filing described the placement. Set 12 inches into the face, sealed with lead. It doesn't come out easily." "If Braddock sees you, he'll see both of us," she said, "because you're going to walk down there directly while I go around the left side of the outcropping." "I'm going to walk down there directly," he repeated. "You're a rancher on your own range, approaching a group of men on property adjacent to a contested water source. You have every right to be here. And if they don't see it that way?" She looked at him with those amber eyes in the dark. "Then you have a rifle and I have a Remington and we've managed worse." He thought about arguing. He thought about it for approximately 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to accept that she was right and that arguing was time they did not have. "Go," he said. She went, moving left along the shadow of the outcropping with a quietness that he was not entirely surprised by but still found remarkable. The specific learned quietness of someone who had spent years moving through spaces where being heard was dangerous. Gideon stood up from the scrub and walked down toward the torchlight. The watch saw him at 15 feet. "Hey, evening," Gideon said, keeping his pace even. "Gideon Mercer, this is my range." The man scrambled to turn and Braddock heard the voice and swung his torch, and for one long moment everyone on that hillside was illuminated in the cross-hatching of torchlight and shadow. "Mercer," Braddock said. His voice had the specific flatness of a man controlling an anger that had been building for several days. "You're trespassing." "I'm on the north boundary of my own land," Gideon said. "What I'm looking at is 3 men with tools at a survey marker that belongs to an active legal filing. That's destruction of evidence, Horace. That's a different category of problem than the ones you've been working with. This marker is on disputed property, and Sutton filed the counter this morning in Laramie County," Gideon said. "As of this afternoon, this property is under active legal review. Touching that marker is a federal offense." Kincaid had stood up from his crouch. He still had the iron bar. He was looking at Gideon with the particular measuring quality he'd had since the first time they'd met on the road, the assessment of distance and threat and available options. "You came alone," Kincaid said. "It was an observation, not a question." "No," Gideon said. "I didn't," which was true, and which became demonstrably true at that moment, because Evelyn came around the left edge of the outcropping at a run, not toward Braddock, not toward Kincaid, but straight at the rock face, and she dropped to her knees at the marker and put both hands on it before anyone on that hillside had fully processed what was happening. Kincaid moved. He was fast, faster than men his age had a right to be, the speed of someone who had kept himself sharp as a professional requirement, and he covered the ground toward her with the iron bar still in his hand. Gideon was already moving. He hit Kincaid from the side before the man reached Evelyn. Not a clean hit, nothing elegant about it, just 2 men colliding on a rocky hillside in torchlight with all the gracelessness that actual physical confrontation involved. The iron bar came loose when they hit the ground. Gideon got his knee into the man's midsection, and Kincaid got an elbow across Gideon's jaw that made the dark go briefly brighter, and they struggled on the hillside with the particular ugly determination of men who both knew what was at stake. The watchman took 2 steps toward them and stopped because Evelyn said, from the rock face, "Don't." She had the Remington out. She was still kneeling at the marker with one hand pressed flat against it, the other holding the revolver, and the watchman looked at her and did the arithmetic and stayed where he was. Braddock stood with his torch and watched and did not move, which told Gideon something about the kind of man he was, the kind who employed other people to take risks on his behalf, and recalculated when that arrangement became unavailable. Kincaid made one more hard effort, got a knee up, tried to roll. Gideon leaned his full weight onto the man's chest and put his forearm across Kincaid's throat. Not enough to cause real harm, enough to communicate that the calculation had resolved. Kincaid went still. "Done?" Gideon said. A beat. Then, "Done." Gideon got up. His jaw hurt. His left hand was scraped raw from the rock. He picked up the iron bar and stood between Kincaid and the marker and looked at Braddock across the torchlight. "The marker is intact," Evelyn said. She had not moved from her position at the rock face. Her voice was entirely steady. "I want that noted." From down the slope, the sound of horses. More than 2. Cutter had brought Reardon and 1 more, and from the sound of it, Purdy had not waited the full hour. Braddock heard it. He processed what it meant with visible speed, the rapid reassessment of a man whose final option had just been closed. He looked at Kincaid on the ground. He looked at the watchman frozen under Evelyn's revolver. He looked at Gideon. "You think this ends it?" Braddock said. "I think it ends tonight," Gideon said. Purdy came over the ridge with a lantern, Cutter behind him, and the shape of the situation on that hillside required no explanation. The arrests happened over the following 2 days, which was not the swift, clean resolution that stories preferred, but was the accurate version of how these things worked. Braddock was taken in on the night of the spring, held on destruction of evidence and conspiracy charges that Sutton had spent most of the previous day preparing the language for. Kincaid was held separately, the watchman released with a formal caution because Evelyn said it again. He was hired for a simple job and didn't fully understand what he was part of, and spending legal resources on him was a waste. Vincent Caldwell lasted one more day. He had stayed in Reed Valley after the sidewalk confrontation, which in retrospect was a miscalculation. A man with his resources should have left when the ground shifted, but something about Vincent made him stay and attempt to negotiate, which was what he did with everything, and he had not yet accepted that the situation had moved past the point where his particular skills were useful. He came to the ranch on the second morning, alone, which surprised Gideon, until he thought about it and understood. Vincent without his lawyers was Vincent attempting to look reasonable, attempting to locate the version of this where he walked away with something. Evelyn met him on the porch. Gideon stood in the doorway and did not come out because this was not his conversation to have, and he had enough respect for her to know that. "Evelyn," Vincent said. He had the manner of someone who had rehearsed a specific tone. "I want you to know that I never intended—" "Stop," she said. Not harshly. Just with complete finality, the word of a person who has decided she is not going to spend time on certain categories of sentence. "Tell me what you actually came to say." Vincent was quiet for a moment. The rehearsed tone didn't have a follow-up built for that response. "The filing," he said finally. "Sutton's counter. If I were to withdraw my support for the competency order—" "You can't withdraw it," she said. "It's already in front of a court on procedural grounds. The question of whether the hearing occurred is a matter of public record now, and that question has been answered." She looked at him steadily. "What you could do is provide a sworn statement that the order was filed at your direction and that my father signed under duress. That would materially assist the court in understanding the full picture." Vincent looked at her. "That would expose me to—" "Yes," she said. "It would." He was quiet again. The morning was clear and cold, and the creek ran below the north pasture with its usual indifference to human arrangements. "And if I don't," he said. "Then the court determines it through the evidence," she said, "which includes Margaret's documentation of the November 1874 transaction, which includes your correspondence with my father, which Margaret's records establish you initiated. The outcome will be the same. The path will be longer and more expensive for everyone." She paused. "Mostly for you." Vincent stood on the ranch approach and looked at the woman on the porch, and whatever he was calculating, the calculation eventually arrived at its answer. "I'll speak to Sutton," he said. He turned and walked back to his horse and rode toward town, and Evelyn watched him go with her arms folded and an expression that was not triumphant, which Gideon noticed. He came out of the doorway and stood beside her. "You're not satisfied," he said. "I'm relieved," she said. "Satisfied implies the thing deserved to happen in a way that makes it feel good. He'll give Sutton the statement because it costs him less than the alternative. That's not justice. It's arithmetic." She watched the road until Vincent was gone around the bend. "My mother spent years trying to protect what was hers from people who treated everything as arithmetic. She died with that unresolved." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad it's resolved. I just don't feel glad in the way I expected to." Gideon thought about that. The gap between what people expected to feel at the end of a long, hard thing and what they actually felt, which was usually something more complicated and less clean than the expectation had promised. "That's honest," he said. "It's exhausting," she said. "Also honest." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Oh. The court proceedings took 6 weeks, which in Gideon's experience of Wyoming territorial courts was remarkably fast, and which Sutton said was due to the quality of the documentation and the fact that 3 separate parties had agreed to provide sworn statements rather than contest every point. Robert Hawthorne provided a statement from St. Louis. Not the full account, not everything, but enough. He was a man who had made a series of choices that had compounded into something he probably hadn't intended at the start, and Gideon found he couldn't spend much moral energy on him, which was a position he suspected Evelyn had arrived at first and independently. The machinery had ground him up along with everyone else, just from a closer seat. Judge Kellerman was removed from the case by the Laramie County Court on conflict of interest grounds, which was a procedural finding rather than a criminal one, and which meant he kept his position but lost any ability to affect this matter, which was the outcome Sutton had aimed for. Kincaid pled to reduce charges in exchange for a full account of his activities: the document theft, the pre-arrival surveillance, the coordination with Braddock's people. He had been a professional doing professional work for people who turned out to be criminals, which did not excuse it but explained the shape of it. He received a sentence that Gideon considered insufficient and Evelyn considered a reasonable outcome given what his testimony had produced. Braddock fought everything, which was what Gideon had expected, and lost most of it, which was what the evidence demanded. His purchase of Silver Creek Spring was voided. His land holdings adjacent to the spring were subject to a damage assessment. Two of the families he had pressured off their land in the past 3 years were identified in Sutton's filing as potential claimants for compensation, which was not a resolution that could happen quickly, but was now at least possible. He did not go to prison. There was enough legal maneuvering by his own lawyers to prevent that, which was a fact of life for men of his resources, and infuriated Gideon in the specific way of a man who had seen that particular fact operate too many times to pretend it was a surprise. He left Reed Valley. He sold what he could sell in a hurry at prices that reflected his urgency, and he went somewhere else, and the valley let him go without ceremony. The spring was formally recognized as belonging to the estate of Caroline Hawthorne, with Evelyn as the heir. She signed the water agreement on the same morning she received the formal title documentation. It was not a legal requirement, and Sutton had suggested she take more time to consider the terms. And she had told him the terms were already decided, and she had been considering them since the second day she was here. The agreement guaranteed access to Silver Creek spring water for every established ranch family in the valley, at a rate that covered maintenance costs and nothing else. Not profit, not leverage, just the water, and the reasonable cost of keeping it flowing to the places it needed to reach. Thomas Greer witnessed it. Ben Cutter signed it on behalf of the ranching families. Ruth Hollis made coffee and brought it to the table without being asked, because Ruth had decided that Margaret Doyle was the kind of person whose presence improved any situation. And Margaret had decided to stay in Reed Valley for the winter at minimum. And Ruth had taken that as a personal achievement. Gideon signed as a witness. When it was done and the papers were folded and Cutter and Greer had gone and Ruth and Margaret were talking in the next room about something that involved a great deal of Margaret's particular laugh, the loud, sudden kind she'd apparently forgotten to contain. Evelyn sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and looked at nothing specific for a moment. Gideon sat across from her. "Your mother would have done the same thing," he said, "with the water agreement." "I know," she said. "That's why I did it that way." She looked up. She spent her life trying to hold on to something she'd built, and it was taken from her piecemeal by people she trusted. I didn't want to win that back and then do the same thing to other people. She paused. The whole point of having something is what you do with it. He thought about that. He thought about Eleanor, who had said something similar once about the ranch, that the land wasn't theirs in any permanent sense, that they were borrowing it from whoever came next, and the only question was what condition you left it in. "That's a harder position to hold than it sounds," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It requires believing that the people you're generous with are worth it, which requires faith in people you haven't fully tested yet." She looked at him. "I'm still working on that part." "Most people are," he said. They were married in November, 6 weeks after the legal proceedings concluded, in the Reed Valley Courthouse with Sutton as a witness, and Margaret and Cutter and the Hollis family in attendance, and no ceremony beyond the legal requirement, because Evelyn had said she didn't want a performance, and Gideon had said that suited him completely. It was not a romantic wedding in any conventional sense. It was two people who had spent 6 weeks in a legal battle and a rebuilding effort, and long evenings at a kitchen table working through problems together, and who had looked up at some point during that process and noticed that the working through had become something they valued for its own sake, and not just for what it produced. Gideon had said, one night about 3 weeks after the arrests, that he wasn't sure when it had shifted for him exactly, when she had stopped being the complicated situation that had arrived on his train platform and become the person he most wanted to talk to about everything. Evelyn had said she thought for her it was the barn fire. Not the fire itself, but the moment afterward when he'd tied Roy Purcell's hands and then stood in the yard alone looking at the hills for about 30 seconds before coming inside. She'd watched him through the window. She said there was something in the way a person stood when they were carrying a weight and choosing to carry it anyway, and she had recognized it because it was something she understood from the inside. They had sat with that for a while without trying to make it into more than it was. It was enough. The barn was rebuilt before the first hard snow, which arrived in December with the seriousness of a Wyoming winter that intended to be taken seriously. 6 men from the valley showed up on the rebuild day without being asked. Cutter, Reardon, Walsh, Greer's son, two others who had drawn from Silver Creek for years and understood what the water agreement meant in practical terms. They worked through the day, and the barn came up clean and solid, the new lumber bright against the old, the smell of fresh wood in the cold air. Margaret cooked, which was not what anyone had planned, but Margaret had decided the situation called for it, and nobody argued with Margaret when she'd decided something. Evelyn worked alongside the men. She had given up trying to explain to people that she was useful at physical ranch work, and had settled for simply being useful and letting the demonstration carry the argument. By midday, no one was finding it remarkable. By afternoon, the barn was done, and they stood in it and looked at it the way people look at a thing they've built together, not with the self-conscious pride of people who need to be seen being proud, but with the quieter satisfaction of people who know what it cost and that it was worth it. Gideon stood next to Evelyn in the barn doorway with the cold air coming through and the valley spread out below them, and he thought about what the past 6 weeks had produced and what it had cost, and whether the accounting made sense. It did. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, because it hadn't. Braddock was somewhere else causing his particular kind of damage. Roy Purcell had served 2 weeks and been released. The compensation for the displaced families was a legal process that would take years. Not because justice had been clean. Because justice was never clean. It was always partial and slow and dependent on who had the resources to pursue it and who didn't. But the water ran where it should run. The marker was in the rock. The title was in Evelyn's name. Margaret was in the kitchen, being loud and certain and carrying that blue notebook that had traveled from St. Louis to Denver to Laramie to here, now sitting on the kitchen shelf between a salt box and an almanac. And Evelyn was standing next to him in the doorway of a barn they'd rebuilt together, watching the valley go blue in the late afternoon light. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That your mother was right to build something worth protecting," he said, even if it took longer than she expected to protect it. She was quiet for a moment. She used to say that the things worth keeping required the most work to keep, which she said as a warning, not a comfort. Evelyn looked at the valley. "I thought she meant land for a long time, property, the literal things she'd documented and filed and protected. And now? Now I think she meant the habit of choosing what matters," she said. "The decision to keep choosing it even when it would be easier to let it go." She turned to look at him. "You didn't let it go. You could have. When I told you what was coming, you could have told me to take my complications elsewhere and gone back to your damaged barn and your quiet life." "It wasn't that quiet," he said. "Gideon." "I know," he said. "I know what you mean." He thought about how to say the true version of it. "I spent 4 years after Eleanor died being careful. About everything. Not letting things cost too much. Not standing in the path of anything that might require more than I was certain I had left." He looked at the barn, the new wood in the doorframe. "And then you came off that train looking at the platform like you were calculating exits. And I thought, that's a person who has been standing in the path of things their whole life, not by choice, and who hasn't quit. And I thought," he paused, "I thought I didn't have a good reason to be more careful than that." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a romantic story," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a true one." "Yes." She turned back to the valley. The light was going fast now, the way it did in November, the blue deepening toward purple along the ridgeline. Somewhere below, the creek ran over its stones with the constancy of water that had been running the same route since before anyone alive had names for it, and would keep running when they were all gone, and carried in that constancy something that was either indifferent to human trouble or entirely beyond it, and either way kept moving. "I spent 19 days on trains and in stations practicing what I'd do when things fell apart," Evelyn said. "Every scenario I could think of. What if the man was cruel? What if he turned me out? What if the law caught up before I had time to establish anything?" She shook her head slightly. "I did not practice what I'd do if it worked." "How does it feel?" Gideon said. She thought about it with the same honest attention she brought to every question that deserved it. "Uncertain," she said, "not in a frightening way. In the way of something that isn't finished yet, like the beginning of a long piece of work you haven't learned the full shape of yet." He nodded. He understood that. He had felt it himself when they'd poured the footings for this house 17 years ago, when he'd looked at the raw frame and understood that what they'd built so far was the smallest and easiest part of what building it would require. "We should go in," he said. Margaret will have an opinion about people standing in barn doors when there's food. Evelyn made the almost laugh sound. It had become slightly more a laugh and slightly less and almost over the past 6 weeks. They went inside. There is a particular thing that happens to places where hard events have occurred and been resolved. Not healed exactly, because places don't heal the way people do, but settled. Absorbed into the ongoing fabric of the place so that it becomes part of what the place is made of rather than a wound in it. Reed Valley was like that by the following spring. The families who had drawn from Silver Creek under Braddock's arrangement found that the new arrangement worked better. Not because Evelyn charged less, though she did, but because the terms were clear and didn't change and didn't come with the unspoken understanding that everything could be revoked if someone displeased the wrong person. That kind of reliability did something to the way people operated. It made them less careful with each other in the defensive sense and more careful in the productive sense. Margaret stayed through the winter and into spring because she had decided Reed Valley suited her better than Denver did, and because she and Ruth Hollis had discovered a practical friendship that neither of them had expected, and both of them were too sensible to waste. She eventually settled in a small house in town that Ruth helped her find, and she kept the blue notebook on her kitchen shelf, and it remained the most important object she owned even after its contents had been formally entered into legal record, and its immediate purpose was finished, because some things earn their significance through what they carry and keep it after the carrying is done. Sutton visited twice in the following year, first on legal business related to the compensation proceedings for the displaced families. Slow work, incremental, the kind of legal progress that happens in years rather than months. And second on what he admitted was personal interest, because he had told his wife about the case, and his wife had said she wanted to see the spring, and he had found he wanted to see it again himself. He stood at the rock face with the bronze marker and put his hand on the CH 1861 stamp and said nothing for a moment, which was the right response. Kincaid was not seen in the territory again. Gideon did not think about him much, which was the appropriate amount. Evelyn learned the ranch the way she'd learned everything, by attention and repetition and honest accounting of what she didn't know yet. She was not a natural rancher in the sense of someone who had grown up with it in her hands and her body, but she was a natural learner, which in the long run was the more durable quality. By the end of the first winter, she knew the fence lines. By spring, she knew the cattle well enough to have opinions about them that were often correct. By summer, she had rebuilt the north pasture fence with Gideon and 2 hired men, and had replaced the weak post she'd marked with red cloth on her second day here, and had felt something settle in her when the last post went in solid and true. She wrote to her father once, in February. A short letter that said very little except that she was well and that she understood more now than she had about the choices he'd made, and that she was not planning to pursue the full legal complexity of his role in events, if he signed the property transfer documentation cleanly and without further dispute. He signed it. She did not write again. There are forms of forgiveness that are not reconciliation, and she had arrived at one of those, which was as much as the situation honestly offered, and she did not pretend it was more. Gideon watched her figure out how to live with all of it. The resolution that was not perfect, the father who was neither enemy nor safe, the valley that had been skeptical and was now something else, the ranch that was hers in a legal sense, and theirs in a daily one. He watched her figure it out the same way he figured out most things, which was imperfectly and persistently and without a great deal of complaint about the imperfection. He thought sometimes about what he had told her in the barn doorway, about watching her come off the train and deciding he had no good reason to be more careful than someone who had kept standing in the path of hard things. He thought about whether that had been wisdom or just the recognition of one tired person in another, and concluded it was probably both, and that both were sufficient. The thing about love that builds in the middle of hard circumstances, not the romantic arrival of it, but the slow accumulation, the daily evidence of how a person handles difficulty and disappointment and fear, is that it comes with a kind of knowledge that easier versions don't include. You know what the person is made of. You have seen them frightened and tired and wrong-footed and still moving forward, and you have seen yourself the same way reflected in how they respond to you. And you have made a series of small decisions about whether to keep going, and they have made the same decisions. And the sum of those decisions is what you are actually choosing when you think you are choosing a person. Gideon understood this better at 39 than he had at 26. Which was probably the correct order for understanding things. The spring ran through that first summer and the one after, and the creek ran, and the benchland held, and the barn stood with its new lumber weathering toward the color of the old, and Silver Creek Ranch became the name that travelers on the North Ridge Road used when they asked directions and were told to look for the place where the creek bent below the bench, the place with the good fence line, and the light in the kitchen window in the early morning. It was not a perfect place. Perfection was not the point and never had been. The point was that it held, that it was honest ground, honestly worked, and that the people on it had chosen to be there and kept choosing it when the choosing got hard, which is the only way anything worth keeping actually gets kept. Some mornings, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window before Gideon was up and watched the light come over the ridge and thought about her mother, who had filed a land claim in 1861 for a spring she had never seen, in a territory she had never visited, for a daughter who had not yet been born, who had looked at the world she was living in and understood that safety required evidence, and evidence required forethought, and forethought required the kind of faith that wasn't passive but deliberate, the decision to act now for a future you might not live to see. She had not lived to see it, but the bronze marker was in the rock, and the water ran, and the daughter was here. It was not everything, it was something real, which in the long accounting of human effort and hope is the most that any of us can honestly build toward, and more than most of us manage. The creek ran on,